processed foods, ultra processed foods. So we have processed foods and we have ultra processed foods. So all the ultra packaged foods that are out there that are in the store aisle, which are making even, that are addictive, as you've mentioned, they're extremely addictive, and it's very difficult for us to stop. And they're being engineered by scientists who are essentially addiction specialists. It's how do we get people to keep on eating these foods so that we have a greater share of the stomach. But the study was saying that ultra processed foods are responsible for approximately 11 million deaths worldwide every single year are directly connected to ultra processed foods in our diet. And you mentioned one of them, which you and I have a shared background, ancestral. Our families are from Gujarat. We were both born in Africa. That was a beautiful thing to find out about yourself. Yourself in Zimbabwe, myself in Kenya. If you've been to India, when you drive around, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, you see billboards for it everywhere, and that is vegetable oil. You see it all over India. There's all these billboards for different types of vegetable oil, canola oil, peanut oil, this oil. And it's that this oil is heart healthy. There's always a little heart emoji, little symbol next to us. Help us understand how this classification of highly processed seed oils may not actually be what the marketing is trying to say that it is.
Drew, you're so observant. You're so observant. But you see, they got that sign because it's cholesterol free. So because it's cholesterol free, they got the green card to say that, hey, this is heart healthy. And that all came about, again, because of us in the medical profession. We allowed this myth that vascular disease, cardiovascular disease, is caused by cholesterol.
Which is still pretty widely, accepted by a lot of people, even though it's been disproven.
Now, there is no doubt that there's a component here, but it gets a little complicated, and we can talk about LDL and oxidized LDL and why you get small, dense LDL, and that is predictive for cardiovascular disease, but not just your totals. And you can have large. Let me explain a little bit about the LDL particles, and then I'm going to talk about vegetable seed oils. So we vilified fats and LDL. And this was wrong. First of all, when Eisenhower had his heart attack, as you know, we had to find a cause for this heart attack. So then everyone jumped onto fats, and then we had Ansel Keys that came along with his studies, and his studies were not very accurate, but then everyone jumped onto that bandwagon, and this caused the McGovern party to then come up with the recommendations that we need to get off fats and start eating more carbs instead. And we, the people who are so good, actually followed their advice. And we have a 55% reduction in meat intake, and we replaced it all with carbs. And what happened? Blood pressures went up, and heart attack went up, stroke rates went up, degenerative disease went up. We got sicker and sicker and sicker metabolically. And we blamed cholesterol. So anything that then came out saying this is cholesterol free got a green card. Oh yeah, this is great stuff. And that's how vegetable oils got onto the scene, that, hey, butter is no good. Saturated fats are actually no good. Now, these polyunsaturated fats, so there's two types of fats, right? There's saturated fats. Actually, there's three. There's saturated fats, which are found naturally in meats and chicken and in some plants. And then you have your polyunsaturated fats, and then you have your trans fats. Now, polyunsaturated fats are what's found in vegetable seed oils. And they were touted as being heart healthy. But as time went on, more and more studies showed that actually that is not true, because that's omega-6 and omega-9. Those two components of your vegetable seed oils are actually very pro-inflammatory. So they cause inflammation in the body. And that makes sense because they're polyunsaturated. So there's double bonds that can interact with things. So when you have a saturated fat, there's no bonds to interact. Unsaturated fats have bonds that can interact. So they can be oxidized as well, and they can attach themselves to other molecules in the body and the plasma lemma, the lining around each cell. So the polyunsaturated fats are actually pro-inflammatory. And that's exactly what happened in India. that we moved away from consuming saturated fats in the form of ghee, which is clarified butter, and we all moved over to vegetable seed oils. And with it, we saw an epidemic of coronary artery disease in younger and younger people. So we need
For
more
a society
studies.
that traditionally didn't really have a lot of that in their lineage and background.
Oh, absolutely true. Yeah, I was flabbergasted because you're right. Our great grandparents did not have coronary artery disease, and people say that, oh, well, they didn't know they didn't have it. No, 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 no. Autopsies were done, diagnostic studies were done. They did not have coronary artery disease to the extent that we have today, and every time a young South Asian walks into my office, I go, oh my God, there it is again. I mean, it's terrible. 38, 35, they're already coming in with heart disease. And when I look at them, I find two things wrong with them, Drew. Number one, they're consuming a lot of vegetable seed oils. I measure the linoleic acid levels in the blood, and it's sky high. So before, the upper limit used to be 20. Then we found that the population has a higher level, so we moved it up to 30 and said now 30 is normal. How crazy is that? So linoleic acid is a reflection of your omega-6 intake. And omega-6s come from all the processed foods and the vegetable seed oils. Now, why do they use vegetable seed oils? Because it's nice and dry. It has a long shelf life. You can put it in the package. It'll be like that for the next year. You don't have to worry about it.
Cheap.
It's cheap. Yes, absolutely. So everyone started using vegetable seed oils. So the linoleic acid levels are really, really high. And then these fats are pro-inflammatory, and that causes further inflammation in our body. And I found that the LDL particles, they become small and dense versus large fluffy particles. So many times patients will come to my office and they do the advanced lipid panel, which is a blood test that we do on some patients. And I'll find that they have a pattern B. That means they have small, dense LDL particles. And they're doing everything right. And I said, now what's the final thing I can do for you? And I tell them, you know what? Cut out all the vegetable seed oils and start consuming some saturated fats. And they look at me with their wide eyes saying, "Would you tell me to eat saturated fats?" And I said, just start putting some butter instead of other things, other vegetable oils. And they'll come back and they'll find that the panel improved 6 months later. They now have a pattern A, large, fluffy LDL particles, less inflammation. The blood markers that I do also are improved. So generally speaking, vegetable seed oils should be discouraged. And in India, particularly, they advertise that as an alternative, a better form. They call it vegetable ghee, which is a
Right.
very misleading. And so I tell all my friends, families, patients, stay away from vegetable seed oils and go back to consuming ghee when you are cooking. And it's much, much healthier for you. Get more absorption of all the vitamins A, D, E, K. It has a higher burning point when you're cooking with it. It's not going to produce trans fats the way the vegetable seed oils produce trans. Look. You know how we take our foods and it's left over and we put it in the fridge and the next day we take it out again and we reheat it again or we put it in the microwave. You're just generating trans fats if you've cooked with vegetable seed oils. So you've produced your trans fats as well. This is a very, very bad habit. And traditionally, we never did that back home in India. Our ancestors never. We would cook each meal separately. We never reheat the meals. And reheating food that has been cooked with vegetable seed oils is extremely deleterious. And the moment my patients stop doing all that, I see the results. I see the blood tests. They also do better. They have less event rates, but I see it in the blood reports. I see benefits. Vegetable seed oils, absolutely no. So a lot of them worry about things like olive oil. Should I consume olive oil? And it's supposed to be very healthy. Now, olive oil is healthier, but you got to remember that it's not all monounsaturated. See, many people just categorize oils as one or the other. Well,
It's always a blend.
it's a blend. You're absolutely right, Drew. You see, olive oil is about Depends on where you get it and how it gets into your bottle and all that. But it's about 50% mono unsaturated. And that still leaves another 20 to 30%, depends on where it's made and how it's comes into your bottle, of polyunsaturated. And then it has a little bit of saturated fats. So olive oil, generally speaking, is better, should not be heated, should be added to your salads, because it causes when you heat olive oil, you get rid of the polyphenols, and it's got a lower burning point. So I don't heat olive oil. So I tell my patients to stay away from that, from heating olive oil as well. But you're so right about the vanaspati ghee and vegetable seed oils. And I think that and the second problem I found in all my young patients from South Asia is hyperinsulinemia, even though they're not overweight. So the term I apply to them, and of course, 20% of non-obese patients can also have this. I call them TOFIs. It's a term that's been used by a lot of people. Thin on the outside, fat on the inside. So when I look at my South Asian patients, they are thin, but they got a stomach. And that's because of insulin resistance, too much carbs. And what really got me was when I found out that if you look at Hindus in India, 80% of them are vegetarian. And yet they have the highest incidence of coronary artery disease. And nobody questioned that. Why would we have such a high incidence of coronary artery disease in a vegetarian population? It's because they're consuming vegetable seed oils, and it's because they're consuming far too much sugar, and it's all processed. That's the other thing, processed, powderized. The food is powderized. And that's another form of, it's not an ingredient, but it's a form of the food that causes this huge rise in your insulin level when you consume it. So those are studies that have been done in rats and in human beings, that if you powderize something unnatural, since when does nature let you consume a powderized substance and then expect your insulin response to be normal? It just doesn't happen. But we did it. And in India, we grind up everything. And ever since the invention of the steel mill, I think it was around here, 1830, 1840, I don't know. Ever since then, if you look at the curve, the incidence of all these degenerative diseases went up. The milling process is a malignant process. And I think that, your great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, had a stone, and she ground the grains if she's going to consume grains. It was non-processed. It was very granular. And I think that's really important.
Which it meant that it had more fiber content than just the stripped out refined flours that we have today of all different types, which are also becoming very pervasive in the health world. We're using a lot of tapioca, cassava. We're using a lot of those flours, and they're great tasting products, and they're nice to have as like occasionally a little bit here and there. And it's beautiful. But anytime we strip out those flours, which a lot of our ancestors, just because we didn't have access to the technology, anytime we strip out the fiber, because we didn't have the technology, we now are left with essentially a sugar. It's straight up sugar, but the population doesn't see it as sugar, but it has just as much impact on your blood sugar and your insulin as having straight sugar in the body would.
Absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the grain, it's got the outer husk, which is the fiber. Then it's got the endosperm and then the germ. So everything's stripped out except for all the starch. And then you expect that to be a healthy food. And then, of course, because you got rid of all the antioxidants and other ingredients, you add them back to the flour. And, of course, the fiber, not only the fiber, I'm going to tell you a little bit about fiber. I mean, as I peeled this onion, I found so many layers. So the fiber. So they say, oh, yeah, fiber is good for the heart, it's good for the heart healthy. And I said, how? How is fiber healthy? Well, fiber does only one thing. It doesn't do anything for you.
Right.
It's your bacteria. You already got the answer. See, the thing is that there's wisdom in the way nature packages things together. So the fiber does a number of things to you. And from the time that you consume it first time, the K cells, which are in the duodenum, which detect the food that's coming in, and it's going to tell the pancreas how much insulin to make. So they, for some reason, when you consume food with those soluble and insoluble fiber, they form like a layer, and it's like a lattice, and the made of the insoluble fiber, and the in between the lattice is the soluble fiber. And the insulin response you're going to get is a much attenuated response, much smaller response if the food is containing fiber. If it's without the fiber, the K cells will just say, whoa, I've got all these carbs coming in, and let's make a gallon of insulin. See, that's a problem. The second part of this problem is that the fiber, which is missing, your bacteria in your gut are never going to see that fiber. So now your garden of bacteria in your gut, the 10 trillion that you have in there, are starving. And you're going to grow the wrong bacteria in your gut. And because you don't have the right bacteria in your gut, you're going to get inflammation. Definitely you're going to get inflammation because the bacteria in your gut are now turning out to be a huge factor in health, which we totally ignored until recently. And now we're discovering that, oh my God, these guys are our friends. The 10 trillion bacteria are our friends. And now we're changing our mind about that. And that's why the fiber has to go back. And it's not just fiber in the form of Metamucil. No. In its natural state. You got to have these fibers. So that's how it reduces blood pressure. So, oh yeah, fiber increases and lowers heart attack rates. It's through inflammation, but it's not because you're doing it. It's because your bacteria are doing something. And the metabolites from the bacteria have huge health benefits to us. And now we're realizing that diet and fasting changes your bacterial flora. And if you then go back to your good, healthy bacterial flora, your immunology is going to get better, your leaky gut, your substances that are actually crossing over and causing inflammation in your body and causing connective tissue disease and other diseases, all that gets better. So that's a whole new chapter. It's amazing, what we're learning now, and it comes down to what our granny already knew. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? It's just fascinating to me.
It's so fascinating. My wife was asking me, what's today's interview about? I said, if I had to say the gentleman, Dr. J, that I'm interviewing had a mission, it would be that I think he's trying to make fasting. You said this in the beginning of the interview. You said fasting isn't sexy, but you're making it sexy. And part of the way that you're doing that is through storytelling and the combination of patient case studies, what your experience is, but then also the integration of the science component. So let's talk about that. Since you took us full circle, which was beautiful, by the way, this is why I always tell guests, and I don't know if you know, but originally when I reached out to your team, I was like, we would really, really love like an hour and a half of his time. I know it's long. And they were like, he can give you like 40 minutes. I was like, no, I promise we'll do it justice. Like we'll make it a good interview because we're 48 minutes in and we just have the basics that are there. It took that much time to set the foundation and to come back to what started off the conversation. So let's come back to that in terms of fasting. You said, I believe it was one of the talks, it was like, there is no drug out there on the planet that can do the same thing that this not doing of something, not eating, can do in our body. So talk about some of the science that's out there that you came across that really helped you connect the dots and in addition to your own experience with your patients and seeing the improvements with their health. Talk about some of the studies or some of the general research that's out there that really helped you connect the dots around fasting.
Yeah. So when you're not consuming calories, right? When you're not consuming calories, the insulin levels obviously drop because insulin only is produced when you're taking in calories. So your insulin level drop. And I found through all the research that so what happens now is the body, through all its chemicals and changes, realize that, hey, I need an alternative source of energy. Well, guess what? You do have it in the form of fat because you stored it away for a rainy day. Well, the rainy day has come because you haven't eaten. So when you don't eat and you're fasting, Now the rainy day has come and your body has to start mobilizing the fat stores. But the problem is that all of us are hyperinsulinemic. So long as your insulin level is high, those fat stores are locked away. You cannot mobilize them. But when the insulin levels start coming down because you're fasting, now those fat stores, because you get hormone sensitive lipase and other hormones, as a result, the fats start mobilizing. The fats now come in the form of triglycerides to your liver. Your liver will start producing some ketones. And the ketones can be utilized by the body as an alternative energy source. So fasting unleashes a whole new metabolic pathway of energy production through ketones. And you and I do that, or supposed to be doing that, naturally, because it's built in our system to do that. Because you are not supposed to be eating every 2 hours, and our physiology is such. It's we're about more than 10,000 years old, and our genetic engineering is from that time, when you eat now and you may not eat again for another day or two, and therefore during those times you have an alternative source of energy. And we just didn't realize that. We thought there was only one energy source, and it was all sugar, and glucose only. But no, there's this other pathway available to us. So what is the advantage of having that alternative pathway? Well, when you use that alternative pathway, you're getting rid of the fat from the body. So you don't develop the obesity that we're getting nowadays. But more than that, the body makes you stronger because you're going in that pathway. Why? Because the body wants you to survive. So when you're in a survival mode, you're going to come back stronger and better than before. Because look, if you don't have calories, you think you're just going to crawl into a cave and die over there and just become weaker and weaker and I can't think anymore, and you just crawl. No. Nature wants you to come back stronger, become brighter, smarter, stronger than before, go out and get your food so that you can get back. And that's what this ketogenesis is all about. This new pathway is not just providing energy to you, it's actually bringing you back better. So the research that I found is that when you allow this to happen, it's a kind of a hormetic stress that you're creating on yourself. Hormetic stress means that you're creating a stress on the body, which is going to bring you back better. So when you do this fasting, there's so many benefits. Number one, I'll just rattle them off basically. There's a thing called brain-derived neurotrophic factor that is released. And that makes your brain brighter, smarter. You can actually grow new cells and neuroplasticity as well, which is fascinating. Because we never thought that this was possible, that our brains can actually grow back. So brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And then when you do feed yourself afterwards, there's a release of stem cells into your bodies. These things don't happen under normal circumstances when you're constantly eating. So this stem cell mobilization is fascinating information. Growth hormone. During fasting, you get growth hormone. You get more growth hormone production during fasting than at any other time. So your growth hormone allows you to maintain your muscles and repair. That's fascinating stuff that's going on inside your physiology when you are in the fasting mode, which you wouldn't at other times. And then there's this thing called autophagy. And I know that a lot of people are talking about autophagy, and you know all about autophagy, but for the audience, I'm just going to tell them that when you're running out of fuel and substances not coming in, you're going to take all your intracellular redundant parts of your cells and say, you know what? I'm just going to use these for energy because I need energy, right? So under the circumstances of fasting and some ketone production, you're going to take your intracellular organelles that are redundant, and you're going to basically package them into lysosomes and basically export them out of the cell so that the body can utilize them. Now, what you've just done is you've cleaned up your intracellular debris, as it were. And same thing with old mitochondria. You're going to get rid of your old mitochondria because the body is now saying, you know what, I'm out of fuel here in the house. My fire is getting down. Well, there's this old piece of furniture. I'm going to burn this old piece of furniture. That's what it's doing. It's getting rid of redundant furniture. Now, when you feed yourself again, those parts are going to be replaced. So the science is now showing that when you clean up your mess in your cells and then you do feed yourself again, you're going to get new mitochondria, you're going to get better intracellular functions, and energetics is going to get better in the cell. So I have found, especially right now with everything that's going on with post COVID and the patients coming in no energy whatsoever, and I tell them to do fasting, the energy gets better. And I said, why is that? It's because they're getting mitophagy, their mitochondria are getting better. They're getting new, better mitochondria. So the fasting process is not just about losing weight, it's about changing your entire cellular mechanisms. And we're supposed to have that. That's what keeps us young. Our telomeres also get longer when we're doing this. They don't shorten so fast, I should say. So there are so many biochemical changes, Drew. It's crazy that we didn't take advantage of this pathway before. So everybody gets into a ketotic state at a different level of their fasting. It just depends on what your diet has been before, how much sugar you've been consuming in your diet. But let's say that, like, I eat once a day. That's what I do. So for me to get into ketogenesis is very easily. I start spilling some ketones very quickly. By about 16 hours, I'm already got some ketones in my urine. So I know that I'm in that pathway. Others may take them a little bit longer, but then slowly it becomes shorter and shorter and shorter. So you start producing some. So what I'm saying is that you need this metabolic flexibility to become healthier, and to heal some of the bad things that have happened as a result of our lifestyle and diet. So fasting has, to me, as you said in the beginning, as a cardiologist, I realized that when you first start your fasting, you're going to get rid of your addictions. It's going to be a tough process for a couple of weeks. Then you start fasting 1 day a week. Skip one meal a day, maybe for 3-4 days, and then skip 2 meals a day for the next week or 2 weeks, so that your body's getting used to it. Look, I didn't die. Nothing happened. I missed 2 meals, but I'm still here. I felt okay. And it empowers the patient to say, I can do better. And then the next time they say, evening came about. It was supposed to be my meal. I'm not hungry. I feel good. I'm just going to skip it. I'll go to tomorrow morning. You just did a 36-hour fast. So that's how I empower them to gradually get into it. Because if we just go straight to fasting, they fail. They fail miserably, and they feel terrible, and then they won't come back to you. They'll say, "Oh, I can't do this fasting stuff." But you got to do it gradually. You got to just learn to skip meals, and know what to expect. You're going to get some cravings, and these are all part of your addictions in the beginning. Then you're going to get some besides the cravings and the addiction symptoms, you might get electrolyte imbalance. That's why you got to drink lots of water, because as your insulin levels come down, you will find that you'll have a diuresis. You'll have much more urine output. So you need to replace sodium, because with insulin, when your insulin levels are high, you hold on to salt and water. When your insulin levels come down, you start mobilizing all that. So you start having a diuresis. I'm making so much urine, and you're losing salt. So if you get cramps and you're getting cramping in your legs and arms, I tell them to take a little bit of salt with the water, and they start getting better. So now all of a sudden they say, I feel good. Yes, doc told me about my cramps. I took salt. He told me about my cravings and my behavior, and I'm just going to have to work my way through that, because I'm a junkie. He called me a junkie, so I'm a junkie now. So I'm getting out of it. So it'll take me 2 weeks to undo all that. And after 2 weeks, they feel empowered. I did it. And then they start feeling better. The mental fog is gone. They're sleeping better. Their memory is better. And at the end of the day, they just feel so much energy inside them. And they say, doc, I never felt so much energy before. And they will go and they work out in the gym. They're actually holding on to more muscle as well, because their growth hormone levels are higher as well. So they come back and they tell me all this. I feel great, doc. I don't know what it is, but this fasting stuff is really working with me. And if they're really obese, once they've reached this stage, then I make them do a 3-day water fast. So first you got to do all this. You got to graduate. You can't just go to university. You first got to go through high school and get through all this stuff. So I make them go through all this and then say, okay, now you're ready. You're going to do a 3-day water fast. And then it's just water for 3 days. And now, then we get better results.
Let's first talk about foods that prematurely age the immune system. And then let's talk about foods that do the opposite, that are involved with immuno-rejuvenation.
We'll get to the good news first. Yeah. I mean, we'll get to the good news second.
Okay. So the one that comes right out at the tip of the mountains here, it's visible above everything, are foods that enhance the poor control of sugar in our body. So any kind of diet that then enhances our mishandling of what we call glucose, which is a sugar, that then damages both our immune system. It damages virtually every cell in our body. If we have too high a sugar floating around, can be injured and can be prematurely aged. And these are called advanced glycosylation end products. Now, think, if you would, what that acronym is. Advanced glycosylation end products, AGE, right?
Right.
Now, what happens when you have sugar reacting with our body in such a way to produce these AGEs, these advanced glycosylation end products? They then bind to receptors in our immune system that are called receptors of advanced glycosylation end products. Now, what's the acronym there? RAGE. Our body is enraged when we are having too much sugar that damages our cells. And I think this is a very, very powerful concept, because enraged means that we're in a state of inflammation. And inflammation, where is the origin of inflammation? Our immune system. When our immune system is imbalanced, we are enraged because we're activating these processes of inflammation.
It's pretty mind-blowing. And there's a few things there that I want to pull apart just to make sure that everybody has it. When you're talking about sugar, you're talking about anything that turns into sugar inside of the body. So that's sometimes added sugar from the foods that people are eating. And a lot of the processed foods that we have today have added sugar to them. But we're also talking about diets that have high amounts of refined carbohydrates, which also turn into sugar. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so with both of those items, is there a way that, one of the things that I've found is that most people are not great at understanding how much sugar they're taking in between both of those two categories. It's kind of like if you go to Times Square and you ask people, random person, do they eat healthy? Everybody has a different definition of what healthy looks like. And most people are going to say yes, because for one person, it's like 5 Coca-Colas a day. For another person, it's only 1 pack of cigarettes a week, whatever it might be, right? Are there ways that people, just like you were talking about methylation testing for aging, what are some of the biomarkers that people can look at within themselves to see how far on the spectrum are they? Are there things that you pay attention to or that you look at, or when you're educating doctors, as you've done for many years now, that are a good measure of how we are on that spectrum of where our sugar intake is?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm really excited, and I know you've spoken about this quite a bit in your podcast and discussions with consumers, health consumers, around the revolution that's occurring with glucose monitoring, the so-called CGMs, continuous glucose monitoring, these devices you put on your skin that then measure your blood sugar throughout the day and can track how your blood sugar is influenced by what you're doing. Sometimes it's not necessarily by just what we're eating, but it may be by your exercise, or it may be by stress, or it may be by sleep, that you can start examining how all those things influence your blood sugar. What we do know, as you just said, is that diets that deliver readily available sugar to the body, that could either be sugar directly or quickly metabolized refined starch, will elevate your blood sugar in such a way that it makes too much sugar available for cells, and your body has to find a way to put it. So it just sticks that sugar onto things like proteins, and that's what we call advanced glycosylation end products. And once you do that, once you stick a sugar molecule onto a protein in your body, like to make glycosylated hemoglobin, or people have heard about A1C. What is A1C? A1C stands for glycosylated hemoglobin. And it's where your body had too much sugar, so it stuck that sugar onto a protein in your blood, which is hemoglobin. And the higher the level percent of your hemoglobin that's got that sugar attached to it, the more problem your body had in managing sugar, and the more you are on a risk to diabetes. And so we now talk about getting your A1C down below 5.5% and, getting it close to 5%. People at 7% are people that are already in the diabetic range because they are not managing their sugar well. And it is now starting to produce an adverse effect, not just on hemoglobin, but on all body proteins, can be then glucose containing proteins by this process. Now, why is that of concern? It's of concern because once you've taken a protein that your body makes, like let's take the most common protein that floats around in your blood that your body needs for its daily function. That's called albumin. And your major blood protein is called serum albumin. Now, albumin does a really important job because it takes protein around to other cells of your body to deliver nourishment so that they can eat up that albumin and use that protein to make their own structure and function. So albumin is really an important protein for your overall whole body health. Now, what happens if you have too high of sugar in your blood? You don't just put the sugar onto hemoglobin, it also puts it onto albumin. That's called glycosylated albumin. Now, why is that not so good? Because once you've changed albumin from your friendly albumin to a new form of albumin that is this unfriendly glycosylated albumin, now your body recognizes that as a foreigner. And what in your body is there to recognize foreigners? Your immune system. So what do you know about the relationship between poor blood sugar and autoimmune disease? They're related.
Wow. Because
your body now has a foreigner it's being made that your immune system, and often people say, oh, I have a defective immune system because I have an autoimmunity. No, maybe you have a super active immune system that's even more vigilant in understanding foreigners, and that's why you have an early reaction. And maybe that's why 80% of autoimmune cases are found in women. Women don't have defective immune systems. They have highly sophisticated immune systems because think of what they have to do. They have to have an immune system that can accommodate a foreigner living in their body. Even a foreigner can be the opposite sex. It could be a man. It can be a boy. Think of a woman's immune system having a boy inside her. So she has to have a very, very adept immune system, which makes it very sophisticated, and it may be then much more vulnerable to certain types of mischief that occurs when we start throwing new chemicals like sugar at proteins.
I think this is such an important topic because on the trend of personalization, and personalization can be taken in so many different ways, an important topic that is a topic that's super important for us to talk about is that it does seem that there are a multitude of factors that make women's bodies more impacted when they face stress. And if we don't take in that personalization, then we can't come up with the solutions that biological women need to support their unique body and their unique immune system. And I think it's important to talk about those differences that are there because health sometimes is applied universally. And sure, there's a lot of key themes that are there. But if we don't take into account the different aspects that are there, we may not be servicing women with the exact needs.
Oh boy, I really want to just stand up and shout in support of what you just said. I think it's so important. And it takes us back, again, as a biological scientist, it takes us back even to the way we develop our information. Most all of the studies that have been done for which drug trials are accomplished and ultimately lead to approval are done in males. And why is that? Because females are more complicated. So when you do a clinical study, you want to get rid of a lot of complications. So men are simpler. And so if you really think about all the kind of prescriptions that we have developed based upon clinical trials that lead to drug approvals, they're often not even female-centric at all. They didn't even include women as a major component in the decision-making.
And there was that famous prescription drug that was being tested, and I think women were included and ended up damaging a bunch of unborn babies, and
That's
that led to a whole sort of pullback in a good way. But I think now we're coming out of that and saying, how do we really contextualize all health advice? And the thing that I really appreciate is that there's been many individuals that have come on this podcast, like yourself, who've talked about, okay, great, a little bit of stress is good, but if we are recommending cryotherapy and cold plunge for women 5 days a week, we have to understand that their bodies are different, especially if they're in their prime fertility years. And everybody has to contextualize this based on where they uniquely are.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good underline exclamation point to take away. I often say that we're each unique facet on the diamond of life. And there has never been a facet that's identical to us, nor will there ever be again. And so if we want to really talk about how we make decisions in healthcare, they're generally made on the basis of community or population-based studies. They're not based on individual studies. And so you say, well, isn't there a pretty good correlation between population-based studies and individual needs? Well, on average, yes, there is, but we're not average. Each individual is not average. They are who they are. And so what do we do in medicine? We say, well, that was an unexpected adverse side effect, or that was a non-responder, as if there's something wrong with that person, rather than to say, no, that person is actually unique as a responder. They're not something wrong with them. They're unique in the way they're responding. And the more we actually discover that, and actually there is this whole, I would call it almost a form of using genes as a way of controlling a person's self-perception to think that they're not fully functional because they carry a certain gene that's
using the topic of genes to kind of create a little bit of a victim mentality.
Yeah, well said.
It may be well-intentioned, but it's still victim mentality.
That's exactly right, because genes are there to define our uniqueness. They're not bad genes and good genes. There are genes that define our uniqueness. So if you think that uniqueness is the power of the individual, that's what we want, is uniqueness, then you don't think of genes as something that are bad or good. You think of them as defining our potential.
One more question about the topic of sugar. Glucose monitors are expensive. They're out of reach for a lot of people. That's why I think it's so important to highlight the lab markers that are there. You mentioned A1C, which is one that a lot of people can get from their doctor, and you put out some ideal ranges. We have a link to, a whole report that we wrote about different ideal ranges for different markers that are there. What about also fasting insulin? We've had many people come on this podcast and say, if there was one test that I could order for my patient to help them get a sense of sort of where their body is, not that medicine is practiced that way, but fasting insulin is up there. Would you put that in that same category as well of something to measure how far along the pathway we've gotten in terms of the balance of having too much sugar or being more in an optimal range?
Yeah, I think fasting insulin is another good biomarker. You have to be a little bit careful because it is a U-shaped curve. It's curvilinear because too little is not so good and too much is not so good. And so you have to ask the question, what is the ideal reference range in the middle of that U? And so, something that's probably above 5 but below 15 or even below 10 is probably, using IUs per mil, is probably a good range. So you want to look at both too little and too much.
It's interesting. I've heard a lot of people in the space of functional medicine. Again, there's a lot of different ways to slice it, and it's not like you're only looking at that. I've sometimes heard like 2 to 5, could be a range that would be considered optimal. Below, like right around 5 would be considered like in normal, in a better range and like a good range for the general population. But I'm hearing you say that even potentially lower than 5 could be a little too low for some people.
I think that if you chose 5 as a midpoint, that's a pretty good number. But I would not say, okay, I'm at 5, but I want to go down to 2.
Yeah.
Or I'm 5 and I went up to 7. I'm now really worried. I think that you got to have a little understanding of the flexibility of that number, because it's not, if you do repetitive fasting insulins on an individual, you will find it will change variably around a certain range.
Got it. Amazing. Well, you were setting us up we've covered the things that prematurely age us. Now we're going to go into this topic of what actually can, in a way, when you look at society, it can actually help us slow down what we call modern aging that's there. But to set that conversation up, we have to talk about something that you've mentioned a few times, and it's this idea of immunorejuvenation. Mm-hmm. So let's get like I know you can go super deep, and we will, but let's get the high level of immunorejuvenation and why it's an important topic for people to understand.
Yes. So we've said that when immune cells and nervous system tissues get epigenetically injured, that they carry that memory effect, and then it puts those cells in an alarm state. So the immune system gets in an alarm state, the nervous system gets in an alarm state. And what does that really mean? What it means often is you have things like inflammatory disorders. So inflammation becomes the effect of the cause upstream of these epigenetic alterations in your immune and nervous system. And that has a name that's been applied to it called inflammaging. You've probably used that term. Inflammaging. So it's an age-related principle when you're in that chronic simmering inflammatory state. It's not acute inflammation like a fulminant infection. It's just a chronic simmering inflammation at the organ and tissue level, inflammaging. And its origin is the imbalance of this relationship between the immune and the nervous systems and how that connects with the gut microbiome, the other things that we're talking about. Now, with that in mind, you would say, well, if you're in a state of inflammaging, that must mean that you're carrying bad memories from past experiences that your body holds on to, and it keeps perpetuating that throughout your life, and it maybe just gets worse and worse, and ne'er the well can you ever get better. But now we recognize, as I mentioned, that there are biological processes that actually can turn the curve the other direction. It can get rid of these bad memories, these epigenetic marks, and replace them with new, younger opportunities to be reinitiated to friendly messages. And that is a process that won a Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology, actually in 2014, called autophagy. And this process of autophagy and its companion process called mitophagy, the same kind of process going on within mitochondria, the energy powerhouses of cells, is a way that our body kind of garbage collects and gets rid of these messages that may be deleterious or harmful for the long-term best health outcomes of the individual. Now, if autophagy is not as capable as is the damaging process of inflammaging, now you're in a negative spiral, right? You're getting worse. But if you can lower the rate of inflammaging while you're increasing the selective renewal of your immune cells by autophagy, now you have the process of immuno-rejuvenation. That's the counterpoint to immunosenescence, or aging in the immune system. So this is our light in the dark, that if we can then intervene in ways that can actually recreate the opportunity for our immune system to have lost these bad memories, the bad memories that lock it into a state of inflammaging, now we can actually see forward a lowered biological age and a better health trajectory going forward.
So I think a great way to help us understand how that plays out is we should follow the same sort of listicle idea of what are some of the things that can take advantage of that system of immunorejuvenation that can pull things in a different direction. So if toxins, if intestinal permeability and leaky gut and different foods that are out there and our processed food diet and our modern diet, if those things all contribute to aging and inflammaging, let's go through a list of things that can pull us in the other direction.
Yeah, that's good. So I think the first thing we can say, taking on the theme that we talked about, that glucose, when it's mischievous in our body, is not good, and then we say, well, okay, then how do you keep glucose under control? How do you keep blood sugar under control? And you do so by diets that have a low glycemic load, low glycemic index, things that don't spike our blood sugar, that don't cause A1C to go up, that don't cause fasting insulin to increase. And those are what we call low glycemic load diets. And generally, what do they look like? They're diets that are lower in, as you mentioned earlier, in these readily available carbohydrates that are highly processed, that get broken down into sugar too quickly. So these would be minimally processed whole foods types of diets, the things that you've spoken brilliant to. Dr. Mark Hyman has done an eloquent job in getting people to recognize the vegan type of diet approach, which is to use lean cuts of meat, organically processed, a lot of whole grains, fruits and vegetables, staying away from gluten and other highly processed grain type of products. And for us, as you and I spoke about in our previous discussion, we just happened on to a discovery of something that had a 2,500-year history. 2,500-year history in human nutrition that got lost in America about 200 years ago, which is one of these unique blood sugar normalizing foods called Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. And when we got onto this, it was like one of those coincidences, serendipities. Now I'm thinking back, maybe it wasn't a serendipity. Maybe it was because I was hanging out with some interesting people that were really worried about these issues of immune aging. And what we now recognize is that there are certain foods that have a series of ingredients within them, a series of substances that are made by their genes that help protect those plants against aging. Because our plants have immune systems, it turns out. And our plants have the same kind of problems that we have. They're manifest in slightly different ways, so I don't want to make it seem that the same. You don't see white blood cells circulating around in plants, but plants have an innate immune system, and they have an adaptive immune system like we do, and it interrelates with their immune protective substances that they make, which are called plant phytochemicals, that are there to strengthen their own immune systems. So when we start looking at certain plant foods, we say, whoa, maybe there are some super immune rejuvenating foods that are tied directly into the counterpoint against this immune aging foods that we just talked about.
So we'll talk about the Himalayan Tartary buckwheat in a second, but that sort of opens up this larger category, which is the importance of phytochemicals in our diet, and in particular, these polyphenols, which you've been such a big champion of for such a long time. So we've increasingly done more episodes with different experts that are out there, and this word keeps on coming up. Talk about the role of phytochemicals and polyphenols in our diet, and how does it actually look when we start to have a lot more of them in frequency, which supports all of the processes of normal, or what we call healthy aging.
Yeah, thank you. So let's first just quickly define what we mean by phytochemicals. So that's P-H-Y-T-O. So they're plant-derived substances. Where do they come from? The genes of plants carry the information that is necessary for the plant to do its work. And it turns out that depending upon what that plant is, some reasonably large amount of its genes are dedicated to the production of these secondary substances called phytochemicals. Now, it turns out, this is a little factoid that's interesting, the human being has somewhere around, say, 25,000 genes in our genome. A rice plant has 70,000 genes. So what's more sophisticated, a rice or a human? I'll let that question open for discussion. But all I do know is that a lot of those genes in that rice, the whole rice, as with many other vegetable products, is dedicated to the production of these phytochemicals because they require their own messaging system for them to be made within the plant. Now, of those phytochemicals, they can be broken down into many different families. I'm not going to go through a whole discussion of the library of phytochemicals, but to say that people who are engaged in this process of discovering and looking at these have found thousands and thousands of different phytochemicals in different plants. By the way, there's another factoid. There are over 20,000 edible plant foods today in the planet, of which humans derive 90% of their calories from 6.
Can you list those 6 just for everybody who's not familiar with that?
Okay, so maybe we should
They'll
do
know
it
it
together.
once you'll say it. But
okay, so it's rice, it's wheat, it's corn, it's oats, it's what am I missing here? Corn. Soy. Mm-hmm. How do I get it? I'm at 5 now.
Rice, corn, wheat, soy.
Okay, and let's see,
lettuce or
sorghum, and let's see, what's the 6th?
It'll come back to you.
Yeah, it will. So if we really look at the first 3, particularly in the United States with corn, in fact, it's interesting to note, studies have been done and published over the last few years saying that in a human being living in the United States, that the carbon atoms that make us up, which is the principal element that makes up our body's protein, carbohydrate, and fat, of those carbon atoms, 60% or more come from corn.
Wow.
So
people are walking around and they're basically
we're walking corn, and we're
They're ear
walking
corn.
generally hybridized, genetically engineered corn.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother story. So anyway,
Well, once you understand that, then a lot of other stuff starts to make sense.
it is an interesting theater of exploration, that's for sure. So let's go back to phytochemicals. So there's thousands of different phytochemicals, probably more than 10,000. And so if you go to the 20,000 edible plant foods, of which we eat 90% of our calories as humans in 6 or fewer, then we're not carrying into our diets many of these phytochemicals that are accessible in all these plant foods. Now, you might say, well, who cares? I mean, when I go to a nutrition textbook, I don't find many pages that are dedicated to phytochemicals. It doesn't seem like it's that big of a topic, because these are not essential like vitamins, are they? I mean, can you die of an acute disease from not getting enough of a polyphenol? And the answer is no, you probably won't immediately die. So it's not like scurvy that you could die from no vitamin C, or beriberi from no vitamin B1. But over the course of a lifetime, the subtle effects of having no phytochemicals in your diet increases the risk of virtually every chronic age-related disease.
And can you connect that dot of like, exactly how? What are the organ systems or what's happening in the body that's just not working as well as it should be because those phytochemicals and polyphenols are not present?
So, Drew, you're brilliant, because one of the major discoveries of the last decade is that the role these phytochemicals have. It used to be said, well, they're antioxidants, so they tend to help cells from being oxidatively injured. But now, no, that's not the real explanation. They're not just like preventing rancidity of the body. They are actually regulating how the genes of cells express themselves through this epigenetic modulation process, particularly in the immune system. So these polyphenols have specific activity, these certain members of the phytochemical family that are found in berries and green leafy vegetables and certain whole seeds. These polyphenols have specific effects on regulating the rejuvenation of our immune system. And so if you take them out, then you start aging your immune system. So here is a full circle. We've just gone back now 360 to where we started, talking about immune age as a measure of your overall health trajectory and probably your life expectancy.
This is why we've probably seen individuals like Dr. Kara Fitzgerald, who did her study last year and was published in the Journal of Aging, I believe. A big part of her protocol of reducing people's biological age in 8 weeks included exactly what you were talking about. A lot of whole foods that were in there, minimizing grains, I think she did in hers. The inclusion of a lot of high quality polyphenols that are part of the diet, including things like tea and rosemary and other stuff. These things have a tangible impact, and there's got to be a reason. If we look back at our ancestors, depending on what tradition people come from, there's a reason why these foods were really thought of as medicine. There was something that they knew that their bodies got when they included them, and something that they knew that their bodies didn't get, or what they would be at more risk of when they had the absence of these. This is why we've fought probably so many wars for spices and, all these different things we've done throughout human history, is because we knew how important these foods were to the functioning of our immune systems in our body.
Yeah, I think you're saying it very, very well, that in the end, why people ultimately have selected certain diets is it ties back into their felt state. How did they actually do as human beings eating certain foods over time? And that's why the cultural history of Ayurvedic medicine or the cultural history of traditional Chinese medicine is so interesting, because it used the experiences of observation over thousands of years to kind of codify how certain foods track against certain functions, felt states in the individual. And it became a part of a different way of conceiving a medical system. The medical system was built on observational empiricism of how certain foods and spices and herbs would connect to certain functional felt states in the individuals, from which the pharmacopoeia was developed, versus molecular mechanisms for individual molecules in a drug-based culture as we have in the United States in our medicine.
So you hinted at a little bit, and you guys have been a huge part of bringing this particular plant to America for folks. And Dr. Mark Hyman, my business partner, he's been a huge fan of that. I'm a huge fan of it too. But you talked a little bit about the story of how you connected with the Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. And I want to chat about that for a second. So first is, give us the origin. You talked about a 2,600 year history.
About 2,500
2,500 years ago. Tell us a little bit about this ancient plant and how are people using it in the region that it grew in?
Yeah, thank you. So let's first talk about the word Tartary buckwheat. Why Tartary? What's that mean? Well, it turns out the Tartan district of China is where this was first found. And so it was called Tartary buckwheat. Now, let me first say that I don't know who stuck the name buckwheat on these things, because this is not a wheat. It has no relationship genetically at all with wheat or any other of the grasses. It's actually a fruit seed.
A fruit seed.
Yes.
But so it is the seed of a fruit. Can you eat the fruit as well?
Well, that is the fruit.
That is the fruit.
Exactly. Okay. The fruit is the seed.
Okay,
so,
got it.
And it looks like when you grow it in the field, it's a very logy plant, very tall and rangy. It's actually beautiful when it's blossoming in the spring, but it looks entirely different than wheat because it's not related to any of the grains. It's actually not a grain. And so, and that, by the way, is true for common buckwheat as well. There are two kinds of buckwheat, two different genotypes. One is the Phagopyrum form, which is the Phagopyrum that is common buckwheat. And then there's the Tartaricum, which is the Tartary buckwheat. Now, why do we call it Himalayan Tartary buckwheat? Because it turns out of the Tartary buckwheat, there are two varieties of that. One that was associated with the kind of the foothills and the mid-altitudes of the Himalayan mountains, and the other is more southern form that was kind of a warmer climate, kind of Tartary buckwheat. It turns out that the colder, more hostile Tartary buckwheat, what we call Himalayan, had to survive over millennia in hostile conditions. So it was naturally selected to have really strong immune systems in those plants. So it has the highest level of these immune strengthening phytochemicals. Now, it turns out if you ask, well, what does that mean, the highest levels? Common buckwheat, which is already known to have pretty high levels of polyphenols, particularly rutin and quercetin, if you compare it to our Himalayan Tartary buckwheat, we have 50 to 100 times as much, not percent, times, 50 to 100 times.
Of total polyphenols.
Of these immune active polyphenols.
Okay, got it.
So it is a little like immune factory producing these metabolites that are called these polyphenols. Now, why did it get lost in American agriculture? That's a really interesting question. It turns out that this grain, or this non-grain, this seed, found its way to Northern Europe in cold climates there. Because of its hardiness, it doesn't require fertilizer, it doesn't require pesticides, herbicides. Bugs don't like it because it's so high in these natural immune active substances, bugs won't eat it. And so it was a really great thing for hostile climates and poor soils. It actually even has an aluminum detoxifying capability in aluminum-rich soils. So then, because of its hardiness, it ended up being one of the original products brought to the New World in the colonies. And it was a colonial food.
And how were they preparing it, or what were they making it in?
Yeah, it can be made, into breads. It can be made into crackers. It can be boiled and made into cereals.
And is that how they were having it in its sort of the native communities in the Himalayas that were consuming it?
Yeah.
Were they making it in that form?
They make these things that are, I found when I was over there once, that look like funnel cones. And so they wrap it into a tubular structure. And because this is so impervious to bugs growing on it, you don't have to refrigerate or anything. And so people would then put it in their packs and going out hunting or a long distance, and they would just chew on this, as kind of a major source of food. And it's interesting because it turns out that it's very high in protein, and the protein is very abundant in the essential amino acids. It's high in omega-3 fatty acids. It's very high in B vitamins. It's high in zinc, magnesium, in trace minerals. So you could actually live solely on Tartary buckwheat.
Wow.
It's one of the complete foods, not even to mention all the polyphenols. So it is a unique food that was brought over again by our colonial ancestors, and then it got lost about 200 years ago, to the point that we could only find, 4 years ago when we got interested in this, we could only find one place where it was being grown in the United States. And that was a hobby farmer. There was a former ag research professor from Cornell University living in upstate New York, that he and his wife, who was a nurse, they both had retired and wanted to do something fun on a little hobby farm. And so they got these seeds from the USDA and they planted them. They turned out to be Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. He really liked the looks of the flowers. And so he and his wife became kind of Himalayan Tartary buckwheat aficionados. His wife then, and he put together a little artisanal mill with 100-year-old equipment that they reconditioned. And then they started selling this flour in roadside stands in upstate New York.
For people to make bread and things like that?
They had a whole series of recipes.
Wow.
And so we were introduced then to, his name is Sam Beer. We were introduced to him thanks to my associate Trish Urey. And that led now into a 4-year extraordinary relationship we've shared. He's really taught us about buckwheat, Tartary buckwheat, and to the extent that we now have recently, with Big World Health, purchased his company, which is Angelica Farms, which was the only place having Tartary buckwheat available in the United States on a commercial level. He only had about 10 acres, by the way. So we now have a whole series of organic farmers that are part of our cooperative that Mr. Beer introduced us to. And now we have the only organically certified Himalayan Tartary buckwheat ever produced in the United States. So
that's incredible.
It's been an interesting run.
Would you be okay with the label that somebody thought of Himalayan Tartary buckwheat as a superfood, meaning it's an additional thing that somebody added on top of a base of a healthy diet that you explained earlier?
I think it depends on how a person wants to integrate it within their lifestyle. Because we now have a food lab that's developing recipes and menu plans around Tartary buckwheat, in which you can develop savory items or you can develop sweet items. That it can be made into many different varieties. But as we know, not everybody is a master of the kitchen. In our world of today, people are looking for quick and convenient. So I think that I would call it, in the way that it's being used right now, more as a superfood to augment the characteristics of other good foods that a person is including in their diet to get this added value of these immune strengthening phytochemicals.
Yeah. And just to zoom out further, just to make sure the audience is following along, we really were talking about a list of things that can be supportive, that can be promoting healthy aging, which again, we don't see a lot of in this day and age. We see a lot of chronic disease. We see a lot of inflammation. And one of the things that you were talking about is, of course, the dietary components and some of the list on that. I have some more questions around that. And then the next thing is this, Himalayan Tartary buckwheat, which is really a fruit and a seed together. That is really another way of introducing these super polyphenols into our diet in a way that people really haven't had access to for a long time. And so that's another one. And we'll come back to Himalayan Tartary buckwheat in a second. Are there other things that would be on that list that would also be part of the process of slowing down, for layman's terms, and just using in this language over here that for the podcast? Would there be other things, lifestyle factors, food, ways of going about living that are also a super important part of slowing down the aging process? Yes,
I think the other one that we've only a little alluded to, that is another part of this autophagy, garbage collecting, rejuvenation process, is sleep. Mm-hmm. And sleep hygiene. And, isn't it interesting? I think both of us have been so amazed to see how sleep we were in dormancy related to the power of sleep. And then we had people like Satyananda Panda and Matt Walker, who started to do this brilliant science on sleep and circadian rhythms and eating frequency. And all of this brought us into recognizing that time and how we use time, sometime in restoration, like sleep, is such an important part of our rejuvenation process. And so I think the combination of Sach Panda's work on time frequency of eating, this time-restricted eating, and that of Matt Walker around sleep hygiene, because it's all around how we use time, isn't it? Sometimes taking a rest is really regenerative, because it allows your body to catch up with itself, because you've got all these processes that are there to work on your behalf. But if they're being overtaxed because you're in a state of inflammation and you've got so much debris that you can't clear the house, then you never get caught up and you're always working on a deficit, which is that of aging. If you have time to catch up, your body has those processes that will do work for you, even when you're asleep, to do central nervous system housekeeping.
What's your approach for sweet things in your own life? If you're not eating a lot of processed foods that have these things in them, not that you don't occasionally partake in some of this stuff, what's your approach to things when it comes to that dessert category?
I think it's really important to have planned to indulge, and I think to incorporate planned indulgences into your life. But the problem is today, I think we're indulging at every turn. Like we're eating cereal for breakfast, which is essentially a form of dessert, right? Most granola is a form of dessert. So we're doing that. We're eating granola bars or other energy bars throughout the day that are essentially, again, just desserts with fancy packaging on it. And then, of course, after dinner, we tend to want our dessert, and that's when we eat that. So I think we're overdoing it. That's clear. But there should be room in the diet for sweets and for indulgences and things like that. And so for me, there are a few, I don't want to say rules, but I guess guidelines that I like to abide by.
Let's break them down.
Yeah. So the best time to eat any kind of concentrated source of starch or even something with added sugar, whether it's a piece of cake or whatever, is going to be after some kind of activity. Ideally, a workout, because after a workout, after you've engaged your muscles, you benefit from something called insulin-independent glucose uptake. So typically, when you consume a source of carbohydrates that breaks down into glucose, you see a rise in your blood glucose. And as a result, your pancreas then secretes insulin, whose job it is to get that sugar out of your blood, right? To bring you back to homeostasis. So it shuttles then that sugar into your musculature, into your liver cells. And so insulin is, it's a hormone. There's nothing bad about it, but a lot of us today have chronically elevated levels of insulin, which leads over time to chronically elevated levels of blood sugar. When you consume a sugar source in the post-workout setting, your muscles basically become a sponge for sugar. So when a cell meets the hormone insulin, receptors make their way up to the surface of the cell. These are called GLUT4 receptors, and this is what allows glucose to enter the cell. And the way it works is sort of like a lock and key scenario. Exercise causes those GLUT4 receptors channels to make their way up to the cell surface without the use of insulin. So you end up clearing that glucose from your blood and requiring less insulin to do the job, which all things considered is thought to be a beneficial, I guess, consequence of exercise, because you're doing more with less in the body. So you're becoming a more efficient. You're more efficient due to exercise at partitioning that onslaught of energy. So that's why later in the day after a workout, I think it's ideal to ingest that indulgence, right? I've talked about what's called exercise snacking. So it doesn't have to be like a hour and a half long workout. You could just do some like air squats. Now that's if you're really crazy, right? You don't have to do that. I don't picture too many people listening to this doing air squats before their nightly dessert or whatever it happens to be. But that's where just going on a walk after dinner can be really useful. Studies have shown that going on a brief walk around the block reduces postprandial blood sugar, which all things considered, I think is a positive thing. You can also utilize different compounds to help towards the same goal, like acetic acid or vinegar is a great means of reducing the blood sugar spike after you consume starches, because they disrupt enzymes that break down the starches. Also, cinnamon has well-documented anti-hyperglycemic effects. So these are all, I think, really useful tools for people to have. But indulging every now and then, I think, is really important. It's really great. When I use sweeteners that don't provide any added sugar and don't have any calories. So I personally am a big fan of monk fruit. I'm a big fan of stevia. Stevia can have an aftertaste. Actually, so can monk fruit. And that's why you'll tend to see both combined with a sugar alcohol sometimes, like erythritol. Erythritol is a sugar alcohol. People tend to be afraid of sugar alcohols because some of them can really upset your stomach and drive symptoms like gas, diarrhea, bloating, things that nobody wants. In fact, this is one of the reasons why prunes have such a well-known laxative effect, because they're loaded, they're a natural source of a certain sugar alcohol. I believe it's sorbitol. So you consume too much of that and you're going to the bathroom like nonstop. But erythritol is different because it's fully absorbed in the small intestine. So it doesn't draw water into the gut. It doesn't get fermented by gut bacteria, and you end up peeing it out. So erythritol I find to be actually very well tolerated. Some people say that they don't tolerate it as well, which surprises me, because generally I find it to be very well tolerated, and just the pharmacokinetics of it, it gets fully absorbed. So it's I think very unlikely to drive GI upset. And then there's another newer sweetener on the market now that provides no calories called allulose, which I think is also pretty decent as well.
I know the doctors at our clinic, they're, especially if people have like a long history of like gut issues or were on antibiotics a lot as a kid or other stuff like that, they'll be cautious with a lot of the sugar alcohols because, again, if you have a sensitive stomach, you're gonna have challenges anyway. I find xylitol is more of an issue for people than erythritol, but I'm one of those people that I don't do well with
erythritol,
with all sugar, pretty much all sugar alcohols.
Wow.
I just noticed my stomach's a little bit rumbly. But again, this goes back to processed foods, which even health foods are a part of that. I think there was there was a no sugar coffee mixer, like you add it to coffee. I don't want to call it out by name. And the company's a great company, and I was drinking it every morning, and it has xylitol in there, right? It doesn't have erythritol in it, but also has monk fruit, stevia. Tastes amazing, right? Tastes amazing. But I was noticing for me, after a period of time, there was a part of my hand that was getting like really dry, and like my skin started getting dry, like the way that I used to before I like cleaned up my diet. And so I was talking to my functional medicine practitioner, and they were like, I see this a lot with people who have, sensitive stomachs if they're consuming a lot of sugar alcohols like xylitol. I was like, there's this thing that I drink every single morning, and I've drinking it for the last year and a half. It has xylitol in it. He's like, look, just do a simple challenge. Just stop having that. See what happens. Give it at least 14 days. Cut it out. Didn't add anything else, remove anything, just natural variation in my diet. And that dryness started to go away. So again, everybody's different. And in general, this goes back to your first point where, chances are you're not going to overdo even sugar alcohols if the base of your diet is a lot of these is just basically whole foods and not a lot of processed foods that you're including in the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up an amazing point that everybody's different. There's no one size fits all diet. We all react to foods differently. And so I think that's a really important part of the equation. There was there's actually this push now towards like plant-based, sugar-free ice creams. Well, I guess there's a push towards a lot of different things, plant-based this and sugar-free that. But to add my own anecdote to the mix, I would typically when I would want to have like an ice cream indulgence, right?
Yeah.
I would go and I would buy these sugar-free, plant-based ice creams, usually coconut milk-based, sugar-free, usually have a lot of the sugar alcohols in it, which I typically do pretty well with, but there's also like a combination effect that could occur, right?
Totally.
Like maybe it's the MCTs in the coconut milk-based ice cream combining with the erythritol that's like leading to an upset stomach for some. So for me, I would buy these ice creams, and I would find that I could have a little bit, but if I had too much, my stomach would just be a disaster, right? And so lately, I've been experimenting with just like regular, and also like the ingredients lists on these ice creams are massive. Not that the number of ingredients in a product has any bearing on how good or bad for you a product is, but I think we can all agree that the more ingredients a product has, the more processed it tends to be, right?
Yeah.
So I made a switch. I was like, okay, how am I going to feel if I just eat like regular ice cream, like God forbid, dreaded regular ice cream, right? And so I went to the supermarket and I bought like some just regular ice cream with like whatever the 4 or 5 ingredients is that it takes to make regular ice cream,
Yeah.
right? Whole milk, cream, sugar, eggs. Yeah. maybe a little bit of salt. And because I'm not lactose intolerant, I generally like to be deliberate with my dairy consumption.
Mhm.
And dairy is something that actually my views on that are evolving.
Yeah, we'd love to talk about that.
But yeah, we'll talk about that. But just straight up regular ice cream, I ended up feeling a lot better afterwards than I would with these like more processed fake ice creams that purport to be healthier
Mhm.
than regular ice cream, right? But
Totally.
in actuality, I found that I felt I was actually not prone to digestive discomfort after eating even a little bit too much, maybe, of regular ice cream. So
I think that's an important experiment and part of the larger aspect of when we reduce the number of total ingredients, not that that's an automatic reason to discount a product. When we reduce the total number of processing, total number of steps that go into something, even if we think of ourselves as somebody who eats fairly healthy, we could also see a lot of the same benefits that we're telling people who are traditionally eating extremely processed foods. And especially when it comes to some of these areas where, again, they're just creeping in our diet more so, when it comes to like the processed, quote unquote, whole foods that we're getting exposed to. So let's talk about dairy for a second. You wrote about it in your new book. And I've done a couple podcasts with my business partner about his views of dairy have changed. I've started incorporating like goat kefir in my diet regularly. When I eat a lot of dairy or I eat in certain types of dairy, I still don't feel the best. I break out other things for some reason. Goat kefir, I tend to do really well in. Give me your perspectives and what has caused you to like have a little bit of a shift in how you see dairy.
yeah, so I still tend to be very deliberate about my dairy consumption. I think dairy is not something that I want at every meal. And I think that one of the issues with modern ultra processed foods and meals tend to be that there's just cheese added on everything, right? Like you can go into one of these big chain restaurants and order a salad, the healthiest dish that most people are going to eat over the course of the day, and it comes loaded with cheese on it, right? So typically I go dairy free, but I do think that dairy has unfairly been demonized especially in, I think, parts of the wellness world. And, I guess we can start with protein. Dairy is a pristine source of protein. It consistently ranks as being one of the highest biological value sources of protein that exists. Whether it's whey protein or casein, whey is an amazing, highly bioavailable source of protein, concentrated with essential amino acids, and in particular leucine, which is really important for muscle protein synthesis and halting muscle protein breakdown, which is a really important way to maintain your lean mass as you age, which should be important to aging populations. So I routinely will do whey protein. Now, I'm not lactose intolerant, and I do acknowledge that 75% of the global adult population is lactose intolerant. So if dairy doesn't agree with you, don't consume it. Whey protein isolate, though, is almost 99.9% free of lactose and casein. So even among that, I've seen people that are otherwise dairy sensitive, they tend to do really well with whey protein. For me, whey protein is great. It's a very satiating snack. It feels indulgent because you can find them in all kinds of really delicious flavors now, vanilla, creamsicle, what have you. And newer brands you can get it from grass-fed cows, which you don't really need to spend the extra money to get whey protein from a grass-fed cow, because what a cow eats dictates primarily the healthiness of its fat. And whey protein is, a protein shake is pretty fat-free. But you can find protein shakes sweetened with stevia, and you can make a ton of different recipes with just whey protein. I mean, one of my favorite faux ice creams involves just whey protein and frozen berries. You just blend it all up and you get this really delicious kind of faux ice cream. And you get the benefits of whey protein, you get the benefits of berry consumption, which is, we know, great for brain health, among other things. So I think whey is great. When zooming out, I also think that Greek yogurt is a great product. I'm continually impressed that in a cup of Greek yogurt, and let's just say fat-free, right? That you can get about 19 grams of protein in an 80 to 90 calorie serving. That to me is amazing. That's like a really fantastic and economical way to get very high biological value protein into your diet. Again, provided you're not sensitive to dairy. And then when you go to full fat dairy products like full fat Greek yogurt, cream. You're also getting a slew of really unique and probably important fat soluble antioxidants, which you lose, by the way, when you go fat free or reduced fat. So I reviewed this one paper that quantified the amount of vitamin K2 in various dairy products, and you lose it when you go for low fat or fat free. But in dairy products like cream, you get a significant amount of vitamin K2. You get about 88 micrograms of vitamin K2 in a single tablespoon serving. And vitamin K2 it's sort of an underappreciated nutrient. Most people, when they think of vitamin K, they think of vitamin K1, which is involved in blood clotting. And very few people, if any people in Western society are deficient in vitamin K1, and you typically know because you're prone to bleeding. So it's a vitamin K deficiency. Vitamin K1 deficiency is pretty rare, but vitamin K2 people tend to underconsume, and it has different physiologic effects in the body. It helps maintain calcium homeostasis, so it helps deposit calcium into places you want calcium to be, like in your bones and your teeth, and it helps keep it out of soft tissue, which is where calcium actually shouldn't be allowed to congregate. So it keeps it out of arteries, kidneys, things like that. And vitamin K2 is relatively underconsumed because it is found, again, in full fat dairy. And there's been this push over the past couple of decades to steer consumers to reduced fat dairy. It tends to be higher in dairy products that come from grass-fed cows. And most of our dairy comes from cows that are not fed grass, right? It's found in organ meats and things like that. And so yeah, I think that full fat dairy is a great source of like pretty important, potentially important micronutrients like vitamin K too. And then finally, this has been an area of interest for me for some time, but full fat dairy contains a compound in it that is unique called milk fat globule membrane. And milk fat globule membrane is sort of like, you can think of it like a capsule that encapsulates the triglycerides, the fats that are typically found in dairy. Now, dairy is among all foods, dairy has the highest proportion of saturated fat. And yet, consumption of full fat dairy is associated consistently with better cardiometabolic health. It's not associated with higher levels of LDL, higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. But saturated fat typically does raise your levels of LDL, which we know when that gets too high, that's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And so it seems to be that this milk fat globule membrane, it basically changes the way our bodies respond to the fat contained by dairy. And it's super interesting, actually. Heavy cream and butter are essentially the same. They start out from the same origin product, right? Like butter is heavy cream that's simply been churned. But when you churn heavy cream to create butter, you're disrupting the milk fat globule membrane. And so that's why there have been feeding studies where they've shown that when you feed a person heavy cream, there's no impact on their lipids. They don't see an increase in their LDL, right? But when you feed a person butter, you do see an increase in their LDL. So that effect, that response is thought to be attributable to that protective effect seems to be attributable to the presence of milk fat globule membrane, which again is this encapsulation of the fats that dairy contains that's made up of proteins, different different phospholipids. And so that got me thinking, like, what is the purpose of dairy, right? The purpose of dairy, yeah, it's to grow a neonate, right? And in the case of bovine dairy, it's to grow a calf into a cow. But what part of the animal is the most rapidly growing part of the animal, especially early on? It's the brain, right? And so when you look at what milk fat globule membrane contains in it, it's rich in phosphatidylcholine, which we know is a really important component of brain cell membranes. It's rich in a compound called sphingomyelin, which is actually a core component of myelin, the myelin sheath that acts like insulation for your neurons. And so, I tend to go down like rabbit holes, right? But I looked to see if there was an association between dairy consumption and reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now, an association isn't like a causal connection, it's a correlation, but there was a study that the first author was this guy, Oriel Willett, who his work I've been following for some time now because he publishes a lot on nutrients as it relates to brain health, which you know is my primary passion. And it was a study that involved food frequency questionnaires. So we know that these are not the most reliable because people tend to overrepresent on these questionnaires how healthy their diet was. They tend to underrepresent dietary components that are less healthy user bias, you know. But what they found was that above and beyond every single dietary component, the consumption of dairy was associated with a protective effect against cognitive decline. So all that being said, I've sort of become more of a fan of different types of dairy. I still eat it in moderation. Like I'll consume like 0 to 2 servings of dairy a day. And I'm not lactose intolerant, but I think it is interesting, these connections. And I also I probably used to consume a lot more butter. But butter to me now, I put it in the category of, I consider it an indulgence because it's been chemically altered. And that chemical alteration creates the texture that we know and love and call butter, right? And I still use it occasionally, like here and there. I'm overall a fan of butter, but as a health food, I think it's probably better to stick with dairy components, dairy products that still have intact milk fat globule membrane because of all the benefits that provides.
Yeah, it's super interesting as we just continue to learn more how people's own individual experimentation, changes. Like I want to like whey so badly. It tastes good. There's so many great qualities that are out there, like goat whey, sheep's whey, all these different types of whey. And I've tried whey in different sorts of ways. And for me, again, my journey and health history started when I had really bad acne all throughout high school. And then I found out that it was primarily dairy. And again, being South Asian, Indian background, other stuff, there is a lot of dairy consumption there modernly, but does it also, do my genetics and background also make me more lactose intolerant? Not in the traditional way, but having challenges with lactose. Who knows, gut microbiome alteration, whatever. So getting off of dairy, my skin cleared up in like 2 months.
Wow.
Like I went from being on like Accutane, different gel, all that different stuff. My skin was super bad. Cut out all dairy, and month and a half, 2 months, my skin looked as if it was minus scar tissue, looked completely clean. So then I thought, man, I have the answer. Like dairy's poison, right? And I would tell people, I was vegan at the time. I'd say, this isn't a good situation. Wow. Naturally, then I found the world of functional medicine, started running all my labs and found out that actually, I've been vegan now for like 7 years. Like a lot of this stuff isn't working, even though I felt great when I first started doing it. So I started including back in targeted food. So I would have a little bit of cheese. So I thought, okay, a little bit of cheese, especially like European style cheese, I'm fine. I can enjoy it and I can have it with a little bit of, like dinner or whatever here and there. But in general, I would include dairy. And then recently I saw a couple papers on just on kefir and how like some people that had challenges. And I was really curious because whey, I would get pimples again. I'd get a little bit of acne and things like that. And it was pretty much within 24 hours. Then I started having a little bit of goat kefir in the morning, like a serving, not every day, every so often. My digestion felt good that morning. Like in general, my digestion feels good, but I didn't have any sort of rumbling. I didn't have any challenges. I felt good. It was satiating. It doesn't have any sugar inside of it. So I'd put in a couple berries or some seeds or other stuff. And it's just amazing to see when you've written off a food, but you're open, you approach it in an open-minded way as you did with, the inclusion of dairy back in your diet. You continue to follow the literature and you say, okay, let me try this and see if there's evidence that these studies are saying that this thing could be beneficial. Let me see how I could personalize it for myself. For your case, sounds like it was whey. I don't think you ever stopped having whey, right? You always had whey?
Yeah, I've always kind of integrated whey to some degree.
But more like straight up, like dairy or heavy cream is what you've been trying.
Yeah. That's sort of what I started to like reintegrate. So I was for a little while doing the butter in my coffee thing,
Right.
which I think is delicious. So I'll put that out there. I quite enjoy it. However, I carry a genotype that probably puts me at increased risk of hypercholesterolemia. So, high cholesterol. And I'm not anti-cholesterol or anything like that.
Sure.
I'm an advocate of well-sourced animal consumption. But I do think it's important to like hedge your bets, and to always do labs and to get tested and to be willing to iterate, to always, I don't wear my personal diet, my dietary pattern as an identity, right? I think that's where people tend to go astray, especially today when they make their diet their identity, because then they become unwilling to iterate when new data presents itself, or when they get labs and those labs don't necessarily agree with the picture of.
Sure, they planted a flag in the ground.
They planted the flag in the ground, exactly. So for me, I don't want to cause an undue elevation of my LDL levels when there's no really benefit in doing so. We know that certain saturated fats, and I talk about this in the book, do elevate LDL, right?
Sure.
The way that they do is they reduce the availability of the LDL receptor on the surface of the liver, which is really important for recycling those LDL particles, right? Certain genotypes are not as efficient at that, and I'm probably one of those people.
I'm definitely one of those people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and this is interesting because I recently brought coffee back into my diet, and I want to bring up why coffee could be very particularly beneficial to people like us.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
But with something like grass-fed beef, so with every food there are risks and there are benefits. It's my perspective, based on data, that the benefits of eating grass-fed beef outweigh any risks, because you're getting a highly nutrient-dense food with a pristine source of protein. You're getting compounds like creatine, which we know is reduced in the brain as we get older. Vitamin E, tiny amount of omega-3 fats, but significant nonetheless. But mixing butter in my coffee, especially with regard to the milk fat globule membrane aspect that I mentioned earlier, it's probably going to cause your LDL to go up. And there's really no benefit that you're getting other than the fact that it's like delicious, right?
Also, MCT oil.
MCT oil.
Right.
Yeah.
Any kind of that sort of heavy dose saturated fat.
Yeah. MCT oil, I'm not sure does that.
I can tell you, for me,
it does.
That.
Okay.
It did that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's good to know. Yeah. So I didn't necessarily want that to happen to me, but then I found these studies that found that heavy cream basically gives you the same. I mean, it's a dairy fat. You don't have to blend it, so that's like a great benefit of doing that. And because it has intact milk fat globule membrane, according to the data, it's not going to cause this elevation of LDL. So I'm essentially getting the same product, the same end product, which is like a creamy, indulgent, unctuous cup of coffee, right? But yeah, with like a chemical difference that might be physiologically significant for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's always about that experimentation. Talking about labs, like how often do you personally, will you look at your labs, especially with this, history of high cholesterol or other stuff, or just looking at any sort of, markers that are there? How often will you get your labs done?
Yeah. I mean, I try to do it once a year. And my family, I mean, people know my family history. My mother had very poor health. She had this rare form of dementia that developed when she was very young. And we know that vascular changes occur before almost every other change with regard to Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia, and certainly vascular dementia. So cardiovascular health is crucially important, and it's something that I'm always mindful of. And again, every food has a benefit and a risk. Coffee, I think, is really interesting from this standpoint.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah. So coffee is something that it's the world's most commonly consumed drug, right? It's a psychoactive drug. I love it. But I found at a certain point that coffee was starting to give me that tired and wired feeling. And so I took it out for a while and I felt great. This is another reason that I think many people feel shitty all the time, right? Because they are dependent on this drug that they need to consume in order to treat their withdrawal from it that they're experiencing due to a 24-hour deficit of caffeine, right? And so for most people, when they consume coffee, they're not actually experiencing a performance boost above their baseline levels of performance. They're dependent on it. So they need to consume coffee to get back to their baseline level of performance. So for people who are not regular coffee drinkers, caffeine does provide a performance boosting effect. But for people who are chronic coffee drinkers, dependent on coffee, that caffeine is just you need that morning cup because you're going to feel the unpleasant symptoms of withdrawal without it. And the other aspect of coffee that I think most people are not aware of is that coffee does give you an energy boost, but it doesn't create energy from thin air. It borrows it from later. And that's a debt that's going to be repaid later in the day. So that's what I was feeling personally when I was drinking coffee first thing in the morning. I would end up feeling like a train hit me by 2, 3 in the afternoon, oftentimes leading me to the coffee pot to get some more coffee. And that was starting to just disrupt my sleep. And so I took coffee out to resensitize my brain to it. And then I brought it back in so that now I can consume it at the minimal effective dose for me. And I love it. I drink it now every day. But
what were you having before and how does that compare now? Was it just that you were having the quantity or it just was that you didn't take a break enough for your body to reset?
I was having probably too much. So the dose was probably too high for me.
Which would be what?
Well, I know that I was in my coffee French press that I was using. I was putting probably like 4 or 5 tablespoons of grounds into that French press, which is probably like 300-400, if not more, milligrams of caffeine. And I was also drinking it first thing in the morning, which you don't typically want to do because caffeine can cause an elevation of cortisol levels. But first thing in the morning, your cortisol levels are already the highest that they're going to be all day because of the diurnal cortisol pattern. Cortisol is your body's waking hormone. It's what gets you out of bed. So once I took coffee out first to kind of press the reset button. And then I brought it back at a much lower dose and I try to the best of my ability to drink it 45 minutes after I wake up to an hour after I wake up so that cortisol spike starts to come down. The other thing that I did was...
The other great thing about that is it forces you to drink water first thing in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
Which is also, I think, on one of your posts here or there, people go to caffeine first.
Right.
And then it's like, well, coffee's made out of water. So it's all good.
Yeah.
But that's the first liquid that they have in the day. So they're already dehydrated waking up. Their cortisol is already high. And they're drinking something that's making them more dehydrated first thing in the morning. So sorry to interrupt, but that's another thing that you get for delaying coffee a little bit is you get to sneak in that water and make sure that that's the first thing that you have in the morning.
That's a great point. People, when trying to set healthy new habits, you want a habit stack. And so giving yourself that extra time in the morning and throwing in some new habits in it, because you've got your coffee habit coming up, but that's a great opportunity to drink some water, hydrate, maybe put some electrolytes into the mix. So I brought it back. And also, I learned a few things about how to make coffee healthier. So for one, I was French pressing my coffee, as I mentioned. When coffee has a compound in it called caffeine, which is sort of a double-edged sword. It's a compound that has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity, but powerfully also raise levels of LDL cholesterol. And when you use a paper filter, the paper filter absorbs all of that compound, all of that caffeine, whereas a French press doesn't absorb any of it. So if you French press your coffee and you're prone to hypercholesterolemia, maybe you have high cholesterol, you want to get rid of the French press and use a pour over or a coffee machine or whatever, just something that utilizes a paper filter, which absorbs almost all of that caffeine compound, which again is one of the most powerful. It's one of the most powerfully known elevators of LDL cholesterol in humans. Yeah. And it does this. I forgot how it does it, actually. I think it might have something to do with reducing, again, availability of the LDL receptor, this one compound. But you absorb nearly all of it with just a paper filter. So I got rid of my French press, and now I'm using a pour over where I have an unbleached paper filter that I use. And I know that is actually helpful. That is going to have a meaningful impact, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
I make an espresso in the morning. I wonder if I can make that espresso. My friend gifted me a little wedding present. And it's like, one of those nice Italian machines,
Yeah.
condensed. I wonder if I could pour that through a paper filter afterwards.
Maybe. Yeah. It would potentially help.
And you think it makes that much of a difference?
I do. Yeah. With a French press, you're getting about, I believe it's like 6 milligrams of this cafestol compound. People can look it up. You can easily Google cafestol. I'm not making it up. It's a compound in coffee that's fully absorbed by the paper filter. I think after using a paper filter, you get about 0.2 milligrams or something. It's like a dramatic reduction of cafestol yield in the cup. And yeah, that's enough to have a significant effect. But the other thing that coffee was recently, and caffeine specifically, has been found to do, which is actually a really positive thing, is it was found that caffeine is a natural PCSK9 inhibitor.
Mm-hmm.
There's a new class of cholesterol-lowering drugs on the market that are called PCSK9 inhibitors. So most people are familiar with statins. Statins reduce the ability of your liver to synthesize cholesterol. But PCSK9 inhibitors, the way they work is they increase, by inhibiting this protein, PCSK9, they cause an increase in the availability of this LDL receptor, which is really great for helping to pick up these remnant LDL particles that have been sent out in circulation after they do their job of dropping off cholesterol and triglycerides all around the body. The liver, its job is to pick those remnant lipoprotein particles up, right, before they have the chance to get small and dense. Because I'm sure you've talked about the difference between large and fluffy LDL particles and small and dense particles. The longer an LDL particle spends in circulation, the smaller and denser it's going to get.
Yep.
So we want to do everything we can to optimize the efficiency of our livers for recycling LDL. And this is true for everybody, but it's certainly true for people with specific genotypes, mine included. So caffeine was shown in this study that just came out to inhibit PCSK9 by about 25%. I believe the dose was something like, I believe it was 400 milligrams of caffeine, which is quite a bit of caffeine. So I'm not recommending such high a dose, but it is cool to know that via this mechanism, coffee can actually increase the efficiency of your liver to recycle these LDL lipoproteins, which is great, right?
It's great.
Yeah, because coffee consumption observationally has been consistently associated with reduced risk for cardiovascular disease, for certain neurodegenerative conditions, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, MS, all these things. But it's like, is there a mechanism that could explain that, right?
Sure.
And this is a pretty significant mechanism, pretty plausible.
What is the one food that is the most correlated in this study? I think this might have it. So clinical relevance, French fries may increase the risk of depression and anxiety. A new study found that eating a lot of French fries is linked to a 12% higher risk of depression and a 7% higher risk of anxiety. A class of chemicals in frying known as acrylamides may cause inflammation and oxidative stress in a variety of ways that trigger depression and anxiety in the brain. Some scientists have expressed skepticism over the findings, saying a host of other dietary and lifestyle factors may be contributing. What's your take? I don't know if you've looked at that study or not, but just based on the headlines, do you think there's any truth to there about French fries in particular might be being linked to, at least observationally, anxiety and depression?
I did look at the study, and I'm actually glad you brought it up. I do think that just from clinical work and reading the research and what I did for the book, there is a correlation. I think it's cool that research is focusing on sharing this with the public in an open way, because does anyone love a French fry? Most people do. I've yet to meet someone who hates French fries. But do we need to be eating it every day? And do we need to understand that how we cook our potatoes, because potatoes actually can be a healthy food. We'll come to that later. But how we prepare them, and eating them from a fast food restaurant, not only are the oils impacted because these are cost-effective oils which actually drive inflammation, but fast food French fries in the United States often are coated or have sugar. And they have sugar because the research and development has actually shown us and shown actually the food manufacturers and the fast food outlets, that they can sell more French fries to us if they add sugar. We don't taste it, but it's engineered into the food that it taps into those cravings that we have. So often you will drive up and buy French fries, you'll upsize, and then you'll eat that whole box. And have you ever had that feeling where the next day you want more? They engineered to work in our bodies a certain way. So I think this was a good study, and I think these are correlated.
What is going on with French fries are potatoes, and largely because there's so much consumption here in America of processed and particularly ultra processed foods. I believe potatoes are the number one consumed vegetable, and a huge percentage of that comes from French fries, right? On sort of the national surveys that are there. So we're not here to demonize any one particular thing. We're talking about people eating these things on a regular basis, which obviously they are eating them on a regular basis if it's the number one vegetable that's out there, right? People aren't eating whole potatoes and baked potatoes as much, right? It's not kale or something else.
That's a good point.
It's French fries, right?
It's French fries.
So what is it, right? Here they're talking about acrylamides as being part of that. But is there something also uniquely to the fact that fried food could have some sort of link with anxiety?
So what happens with fried foods most often? So if I'm ever doing high heat cooking, I use avocado oil. Restaurants, which is most times that we are consuming fried foods, I would say, than preparing them at home. They are using oils that are highly processed and are inflammation-driving oils. So not only are they deep fried, then they fried in oils that are unhealthy. Then you get the issue with the acrylamides, and they're driving inflammation inside of our bodies. Once you start to drive inflammation in the gut, you are starting to drive inflammation in the brain, which we've covered in the past. Gut and brain are connected, and therefore the inflammation in the gut leads to inflammation in the brain. So an anxious gut is an anxious brain, is generally how it works and how I see clinically. So the idea of French fries being the number one vegetable and the fact that we are consuming it this way is not helping us. But then, we need to think out of the box, like learning or teaching people how to do air-fried French fries or air-fried zucchini fries. They don't have to have French fries every day. Can they switch it out with, there are healthy carbs in vegetables, so we can get them from zucchini. So there are different ways to do this. But the other factor about potatoes, you mentioned, it's not like we're eating baked potatoes. There are tips about how to make mashed potatoes for Thanksgiving. There are tips about how to bake our potatoes because, neuroscience has shown us that, when you bake potatoes and you cool them, especially if you place them in the fridge overnight or leave them for a certain number of hours, it undergoes a process called starch retrogradation. And what that does is lowers the glycemic index of the potato. Now, it's hard to do that and then make French fries. So I think the tip for French fries, I am a chef, so I love to talk about food in this way, but the way to think about French fries is, can we use an air fryer? The way to think about mashed potatoes or other forms is, can we bake them, cool them, and then use them?
A big through line in the book is metabolism. And how do people know if they have a healthy metabolism or if they don't, right? Between blood tests, visually looking at themselves, how would you actually know? Because what your point is inside the book is that the worse off your metabolism is, there's a link to anxiety.
That is correct. And going back to the fact that the centers in the brain are linked, there are many different ways. Checking in with your primary care doctor, getting your regular routine checkup, your blood tests. But if you're noticing that you are gaining weight, especially around the midsection, that you are exercising, but you're just not losing weight, maybe you're trying to lose weight, or maybe you're just trying to be healthy. Just something that I learned in obesity medicine is, never assume that someone who is struggling with their weight is not trying and is not exercising, because there are many other factors which may be impacting them. But with anxiety, it's, the how we eating is directly impacting that. So how do we take a step back, re-examine what we're doing, and rethink, what can we do to change this, and can there be a correlation with how we're feeling? Because I think that a lot of what I see in my clinic is that by people not making the connection, they continue to eat and they think they're eating healthy. And actually, they are driving inflammation or are worsening their condition, even if their weight is maybe improving. So recognizing that you may be gaining weight at your midsection, you may not be losing the weight if you're really trying hard, that your appetite has changed, that you usually eat a certain meal at home and you feel satiated, and you get up and you maybe take a walk after dinner and you feel fine, but all of a sudden you need twice that amount. That's usually a signal that maybe leptin is impacted or not really reacting, or you have some element of leptin resistance in your body. And what that means is that the body's not listening to leptin. The leptin is the hormone that gives us a signal that we're satiated. So things like that can give you a little bit of a tip off. But if you see your doctor, they will check certain blood tests, which will give the medical definition of metabolic syndrome. But I like people to also be able to educate themselves and have signals that they look for in their body. Fatigue is another one of them, just not having energy. Not having energy to do the things that they used to do. And another one is poor sleep.
How much of the idea of calming your mind with food is about eating the right stuff versus avoiding the bad stuff? How would you break down that percentage when you talk about it with your patients?
I'm always about filling the plate than removing foods from the plate, because I tap into the psychology of how people are, the psychology of eating. When people feel deprived and you say to them, don't eat A, B, and C, I used to do this in early days in my clinic as I developed my protocols. It doesn't work. People don't want to feel deprived and they want to go back to eating that food because you've told them not to. So for me, it's about what can we add into this plate, not demonizing, as you mentioned earlier. If you had French fries yesterday, that's okay. Did you have a salad for dinner? Can we build you in a healthier meal today? It's about adding in the foods that are going to be nutritiously relevant. And I want to take that conversation beyond what I did in my first book, which was a general outline of different mental health conditions. And this is your brain on food, the foods to eat, the foods to avoid. Because what we want to do now is understand on a deeper level, what do these foods actually do? How are they interacting with the microbes, and how can they target specific conditions? But the science had to follow. So we know a little bit more, and it's still in evolution.
What are the most exciting things that you want to talk about when it goes to foods or ingredients and the role that they play, especially on this topic of, helping us sort of quiet that anxious part of the brain?
For one thing, when, the way that I understood and read and researched how we digest food and what we eat and how they interact with the gut microbes, they quell inflammation, and they still do that. They help the environment in the gut. They help those microbes, the trillions of microbes that live in the gut, to help with vitamin production. Incredibly important when it comes to conditions like anxiety. Help with hormone production. Women in the stage of menopause may be more anxious. So these microbes are important. They help with sleep, circadian rhythm, our internal body clock. They help with immunity. 70% of the immune system is in the gut. They help with mental health. So they are active. But you might eat spinach and leafy greens, rich in multiple different nutrients, but also folate, vitamin B9. And we know that that helps anxiety. But once the folate is broken down with those microbes, it also impacts the neurotransmitters, and which neurotransmitters impact your brain health and impact your anxiety. So if you think about SSRIs, they are used, things like Prozac or Zoloft are used to target symptoms like anxiety. But you can, depending on how severe your anxiety is, really try to eat the foods that can do a similar thing through the mechanism of working with the gut microbiome. Now, take a single thing that people love to eat: dark chocolate. Dark chocolate, especially the extra dark, more natural chocolate, I'm not talking about our traditional candy bars, contain cacao. Cacao is actually the largest plant-based source of non-heme iron. And there's a very large percentage of people in the world, especially women of childbearing age, who are iron deficient. So if you eat chocolate, here's a really cool tip. The cacao is going to help. It's a rich flavanol that will help calm anxiety. It's a probiotic-rich food because of how cacao and the cacao bean are processed. But if you eat it with vitamin C, like from an orange, and you eat a piece of dark chocolate, that helps the absorption of the iron. So it will help you give your body a nutrient that it actually needs to keep you calmer. So these are just little things that you can do through food. Plus, that's one of my favorite desserts or sweet snacks to have, because you're getting it from natural sources.
Do you write about your own story about sort of anxiety and it building up a little bit during the pandemic and other things? Do you want to chat about that for a second?
I would. And my main purpose through was to share with people that anxiety can also come from positive sources. It's not always negative. Sometimes you feel anxious and actually good things are happening and you don't realize it, but you suddenly have this overwhelming level of anxiety. I had my first bout of anxiety I've spoken about before when I had a cancer diagnosis years ago. And that was one of my most powerful lessons in being able to use food to help my treatment and helps really fend off side effects and keep my health stable while I went through chemotherapy. But over the course of writing my first book coming out, it sort of was one of those books that came out in the early pandemic, but then it sort of took off at a certain point. And this was good. This was actually good news and everyone was excited. But I also found myself trying to work faster and harder to keep up with the demand that I needed to put in to make it continue. And I didn't realize the amount of stress that was building up with that. And yet the outcome was all good. The book was selling, people were liking it, as in being invited to more podcasts and more things to share the book. But that I didn't even realize was a driver. And then I had a very positive experience where I was invited to one of the first conferences that went back to being live in the UK. And upon accepting the conference invitation as a keynote speaker in mental health, this was the Personalized Lifestyle and Medicine Conference in 2022, I got an email, which I thought was fake, which wasn't, saying, thank you for accepting this keynote. We'd like you to be one of very few physicians being invited to meet personally with the then His Royal Highness Prince Charles. This was, looking back, was a month before he became king. And of course, no one knew that we were going to lose Queen Elizabeth. So this was, I'd read this email, I couldn't believe it. Then I thought, no, this is fake. Of course it wasn't. But these are, what goes on in your head. This was a very positive experience for me and for my career and has led to really more wonderful things that have come out of it. I was so unboundedly anxious. I couldn't get myself together. I couldn't think straight. But, I had to work through that and understand through the eyes of my patients that this is a very real feeling. And sometimes when you're experiencing such levels of anxiety, it can be coming from a good source. It may not be something that we always assume it's negative or it's bad. But it doesn't mean that you still need a solution, is what I'm trying to say.
So was there any solution? I think about that moment. It's like, everybody's going to have some, the way you're describing it is like positive anxiety. Do you have these moments in your life where you're feeling nervous, trepidatious towards something that's there? Do you feel like that's something that has to be intervened on, or are there techniques that you brought in that situation to kind of help you with that? And I'm not hearing you say necessarily that's a bad thing. Really what you're talking about inside the book is the chronic anxiety that people face.
The chronic and unremitting anxiety, or the anxiety that we know through medications is not fully treated. We know this from data that about approximately 50% of people take medication and they still remain anxious, and some never go into remission. So we know we need more solutions. For me, these were techniques I actually learned while I was as I was growing up. Yoga and meditation from my grandparents as I was growing up, and they would babysit me when my mom was in medical school. But as I went through medical school later on, I learned breathing techniques, and research has shown that things like pranayama yoga or breathwork yoga can reduce anxiety. So a study done actually looking at heart rate and heart rate variability in 2020 actually showed that just pranayama yoga was lowering anxiety levels. And I just felt that going back to learning a breathwork exercise was a simple thing. Even the power of a deep breath was very important. I feel that things like breathwork, hydration, simply remaining hydrated. I've had patients have severe panic, not realizing they were dehydrated. and having a mindfulness practice that really appeals to you, something that is personal to you and works for you. That's a very big word. It means very many things to different people, as does the word meditation, but something that works for you. For me, it's listening to calming music, having something on my iPhone I can listen to, being able to step outdoors, spend some time in sunlight before I put on my sunblock or sunscreen, because the vitamin D is so important to helping. So there are things that I just try to build into lifestyle choices. And I think that if we have some of that groundwork done, then we're doing a lot of stuff that's going to help us along the way. Food is a big component of that, but it's one of the things that we build in. So I turned to a lot of that initially. I've never taken a medication for anxiety myself, but I do believe that some of my patients have truly needed these medications, so I'm not against them. But I want them to know, and people to know, there are many, many steps we can be taking to actually lay some groundwork. So when that panic or that anxiety is really high, that you have those things you can tap into.
You mentioned panic attacks, and some people who have such severe anxiety struggle with panic attacks. Are you aware at all about some of the dialogue and conversation around sort of how a massive drop in blood sugar that comes from sort of a massive spike in blood sugar can induce panic attacks in some people?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and I've actually seen that. A patient that I treated pre-pandemic experienced that, not realizing while training for a marathon, she was being encouraged before she came to see me, she was being encouraged by a nutritionist to eat a certain way to help her training for the marathon. I thought retrospectively some of that information should have been tweaked for her, because what was happening is she was an otherwise healthy eater, but she was having a very high, and this was specific to her body, not saying all marathon runners will experience this, but for her, whatever diet she was eating was raising her blood sugar, and it was falling precipitously. So that sort of sugar crash that people experience when they eat things like donuts or, sort of a very sweet breakfast, for example. And what was happening is she was actually reaching hypoglycemia and feeling very, very anxious and almost panicked. So these again are simple things that we can resolve if we are paying attention to a more healthy diet than not. I'm a big proponent of people enjoying life. And if eating a piece of birthday cake is what a person wants to do on their birthday, I'm not against that. I feel like there's a lot of joy in how people eat, but it's about, going back to that plate for the most times, the most number of days of that week, filling that plate with the healthier foods than the packaged processed foods and the fast foods and junk foods, and really being aware of things like sugar and where we're getting our sugar from.
Yeah, I think that awareness piece is a big part, because a lot of people don't realize that many of the foods that they're being marketed as healthy, like down the street from this studio here in Los Angeles, and you can see them all over LA. There's like an acai bowl place.
Yes.
And acai as a fruit is incredible.
Yes. And
it has tons of phytonutrients, antioxidants, all these different things that are there. The acai bowl places, typically it's like more sugar than like, 2 Coca-Colas. Right?
I'm so glad you
said that. The bananas,
that.
The sweetened acai that's there, then people drizzle honey on top, then they add a bunch of other things.
Yes.
It can be, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 grams of carbs, depending on how somebody prepares it. Correct. Especially when they start to add in, granola and other things. They think, wow, this is like a very healthy way to start the day, especially breakfast.
Right.
And because most people have never tracked their blood sugar, they don't see that they have this big spike and they go down. But generally, most people, in fact, if you experience being hangry in the day, that's also a version of your blood sugar dropping.
Yes, it is.
Not that that's an immediate situation that you're somebody who's unhealthy, but there is blood sugar dysregulation that you're experiencing when you get hangry.
You are so correct. I want to go back to that the fruit bowl, acai bowl, because I actually wrote about this recently, and also one of the places that I've seen people go in to get this breakfast bowl, right? And I've actually looked at multiple times, and I keep thinking a few things. One, there's about 4 servings in the one bowl that you are buying to eat yourself. right? Because if you think about it, the amount of each ingredient is high. The acai on its own is great. If you have blueberries in there on their own, they're great, a little quarter cup. But when you put them all together and you add the different layers, the granola has added honey, then you're adding drizzling honey on top of that. So people don't realize these are actually sugar bombs. And they are not necessarily the healthiest way to consume those foods, and in consuming those individual ingredients is very different. They completely they wreak havoc with your blood sugar when you eat them that way. And I think that so many things. Another one is fruited yogurts. We've talked about this before. A half cup with blueberries in it is very different from if you consume dairy. A half cup of plain yogurt with a little quarter cup of blueberries and some cinnamon, which actually helps the blood sugar, is totally different from a fruited yogurt, which can have up to 6 teaspoons of sugar in it because of the added sugars. So very, very different products, and causing such sways to your blood sugars that you can actually feel super anxious on account of that.
Yeah, I was just looking it up for French fries. For a large serving of French fries, it's 64 grams of carbohydrates. And those carbohydrates turn into sugars in our body. We're not here to demonize carbs, but when you eat that by itself, right? Especially people often eat their French fries first before they even eat, their burger or their burrito or whatever else they're getting along with it. That has an immediate, separate from the acrylamide, which has some potentially toxic aspects of it in high dosages and concentrated. That in itself is this rush of sugar, which is over a period of time, day after day, is going to wreak havoc on your metabolism.
It is going to wreak havoc. And something that there's some very interesting data on this. Again, I'm not demonizing sugar. We need natural sugars for our bodies to work. And we're not demonizing carbs either. But carbs also exist in healthy cruciferous vegetables. But 4 grams, if you're looking at a food label, another thing that often tricks us is our recipes in the United States are in pounds and ounces, but our food labels are in grams. So 4 grams of sugar is 1 teaspoon. And that's an easy conversion just to use when you're shopping online or you're in the supermarket. By understanding that, now it wouldn't directly convert from 64 grams of carbs, but if you think about it, you're somewhere in a very high range. But if you're just looking at sugar or added sugars on a food label, that's an easy conversion. And that's how you can know in a half cup of yogurt that you're getting up to 6 teaspoons of sugar. And I think just understanding that despite the labels of healthy, natural, organic, whatever the label says, actually look at the ingredients, because that's empowering yourself in your own mental health dialogue to know that you're not consuming too much of the wrong ingredients.
Well, one of the big things you talk about in the book is that it's, as you mentioned, sugar has its challenges in these concentrated forms, largely because it's removed from dietary fiber. So do you want to talk a little bit about dietary fiber and how that plays into this whole thing?
So dietary fiber, there's been an emergence of really good books and data and research over the last few years, understanding fiber a little bit better. As I say, fiber used to be what we thought our grandmothers drank in little orange drinks because, maybe she's having a problem going to the bathroom. Fiber is much more serious than that. It is an ingredient in food that we really need. We definitely need protein, but Americans tend to focus on counting protein grams and ignore fiber. So we are eating much less fiber than we should. You get fiber from plant foods, from beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, healthy whole grains. I guide people to whole grains versus, the processed, ultra-processed grains. So I think that having some of that in your diet is important, not the whole thing. Fiber is the main nutrient for the gut microbes. So the gut microbes, the trillions of them that live there, really look to fiber to nurture them. So by taking care of those gut microbes, you are taking care of your physical health, all of the functions of those microbes that we talked about earlier, plus your mental health. Fiber is also satiating. So I always say fiber is your friend when you're anxious. Why? Because a fiber-filled food would break down more slowly in your body, would not cause that blood sugar spike, would metabolize more slowly in your body, and you would feel full. It's not feeling hungry after you've eaten a donut 20 minutes later and wanting a second and third donut. And think about if you've ever had that experience when you have a more satiating meal. So fiber is a very powerful ingredient that I think we kind of need to be paying more attention to, just by including, and a simple, easy way to do it is building up your salad bowl. Not the acai fruit bowl, but the salad bowl with your different colors of vegetables, the different beans, nuts, seeds, all sorts of things, your clean proteins, whether that's chicken or beef, whatever it is that you prefer, to really add to your fiber.
What are some top foods that are out there that people might be wanting to pay attention to?
We definitely want to avoid partially hydrogenated fats. That's definitely up there. So partially hydrogenated fats are fats that are in boxes, bags, processed food. Those types of fats are devastating for neuronal membranes. They will be a serious factor in your brain health if you consume those on a regular basis. So you definitely want to avoid partially hydrogenated fats. And then there's a strong relationship with certain food proteins that have been linked to brain inflammation and more in the population. The most common ones are gluten sensitivity, dairy, casein sensitivity. Other ones are egg protein sensitivity, but those are specific to if you actually are sensitive to them and you react against them, right? And then you can look at it from food groups that just secrete more insulin. So higher carbohydrate, higher sugar, higher concentrated sugars release more insulin. Insulin turns on the inflammatory mechanisms in the brain. Insulin causes insulin resistance in the brain. Insulin elevations can disrupt neurotransmitter transport mechanisms of the brain, so they can cause a lot of disruption. So it's really just like processed fats, certain inflammatory foods people are reactive to, really high carbohydrate, high sugar grains. Those are all the things that for sure are bad for the brain. It's the stuff everyone already knows. But,
you would think everybody knows it, but then you go to the grocery store and it's obviously very clear that a lot of people don't know it, which is why we put some of this content, and so much of what you do is putting out information for free, because slowly, more and more people are learning. But if you go to Times Square and you talk about partially hydrogenated fats or certain types of fats that are not good for the brain, you're going to get a blank stare, and most people are going to not have any clue what you're talking about.
Right. That's true.
So what is it about those fats? And also, what do you think about seed oils? There's a lot of conversations about seed oils online, and you have people that are using sort of big, large observational studies on seed oils, things like canola oil and soybean oil, and showing that seed oils are associated with less vascular disease and things like that. And then you have a lot of functional medicine doctors who feel that seed oils are quite inflammatory and really want to get their patients, off of those things. So I'd love to get your opinion on seed oils, canola oil, corn oil, soybean oil, all those in those categories.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, trends that happen in functional medicine and in the community. There's, obviously any processed oil is really the problem. Like if you have rapeseed oil, canola oil, cold pressed rapeseed oil has really, really high amounts of EPA and DHA in there. For some people that can't take fish oils, they can really turn on the brain function pretty quickly. The stuff you get at the grocery store that's just processed canola oil, that's, not the best thing. And there's definitely a major concern now for people that have lectin sensitivity. There's like seeds are getting concerned as a concern for people. Obviously corn and how these things are processed. The processing of the oil itself and the proteins will be more of an issue than the actual food source itself. So that's something to think about too. We kind of just think of it, well, it's just corn, but it's not corn. It's the process of going through becoming an oil that changes the structure of the proteins. Structures of proteins change when you heat them. Structure of proteins change, become more immunogenic or more inflammatory through different processes. So in the world of immunology, a protein has a shape, and as those heating processes and processes change the shape, they become proteins that can become more immune reactive and more inflammatory, even though the original source was corn or was seed. So I think there's some truth to concerns for the seed oils being an issue, and it's most likely, not necessarily the seed, because seeds can provide a really great source of essential fatty acids, assuming that a person doesn't have protein reactions to the lectins, which some percentage of the population do. And that's the key thing is, these larger studies are looking at generalizability for the whole population. But really, when we get to chronic illness, there's individuality, and some people may not have any problems with seeds, and some people have significant problems with seeds. But the processing of seed oils, for sure itself, is most likely the main issue, not so much the food source itself. But yes, I would say you probably want to limit those. If you get natural oils, olive oil, avocado oil, those would be better than the seed oils for sure.
We recently had one of your friends and colleagues on the podcast talking about leaky gut, Dr. Elroy Vijdani, who has nothing but the kindest things to say about you, like holds you in such high esteem.
Me too. Yeah.
And, he was talking a little bit about the connection between a leaky gut and a leaky brain. I'd love you to expand on that a little bit. How is it that a leaky brain can become leakier over time? And now some of the things that we used to be able to handle when we were younger, all of a sudden cause a lot more damage as we start to begin aging, and could contribute to things like cognitive decline and even increasing our risk of things like Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yeah, there's definitely a relationship between leaky gut and leaky brain that are out there. And we've actually published a paper, I think we published a paper in International Journal of Molecular Science, where we looked at some associations between people that have Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. We measured markers for intestinal permeability, and we found really, really high associations and risk factors for them also having leaky brain. There's different proteins that show up with leaky brain. They're, not to get too technical, it's like S100B, aquaporin protein antibodies, but you can measure proteins in a laboratory setting in a research study to determine if someone has some kind of barrier compromise. But for the most part, there's some relationship specifically to a protein called zonulin. Zonulin is a messenger protein that opens up the tight junctions of the intestinal tract, and they also open up the tight junctions of the brain. So the signaling mechanisms and the molecules that open up the tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier are identical to the gut barrier and also identical to the lung barrier. So usually when there are inflammatory mechanisms or things that increase zonulin level elevation, like people have celiac disease, when they get exposure to gluten, there's an increase of zonulin. Zonulin is going to open up all the barriers. It's going to open up the blood-brain barrier, the gut barrier, the lung barrier. And defensive and physiologically, zonulin is there to open up barriers so we can get rid of a pathogen or get rid of a substance that's in our gut or in our lung barrier or in our brain. So we have to open that up. Also, when the brain is injured, the brain's inflamed, the blood-brain barrier does open up. And traumatic brain injuries, for example, open up the blood-brain barrier because you have to bring in cells like natural killer cells and T cells to get rid of the debris in the brain. So when there's a lot of inflammation in the brain, they do open up. So when you get inflammation in the gut, the inflammatory mediators in the gut can activate messengers in the brain, the glial cells. Those glial cells then trigger mechanisms. Zonulin's released, the blood-brain barrier opens up to deal with anything that could be in the brain. But if it stays chronically opened up and there's chronic inflammation and chronic injury, you can have some serious problems. Now, if you look at, for example, studies done with traumatic brain injuries, people get head injury, their blood-brain barrier can be open for 6-7 weeks after the brain injury. It can sustain and be open even for months and months and years if the inflammation continues that's there. And then that can accelerate neurodegenerative changes. And then when you look at, so it's like the blood-brain barrier opens up, now things that shouldn't cross can now cross. So larger base chemicals can cross into the brain. Now you can get aluminum and iron buildups, iron depositions in the brain. Those are linked to neurodegenerative diseases. You can have antibodies and pathogens cross into the brain. They've already been linked to like plaquing and Alzheimer's disease. So yeah, there's definitely gut-brain relationships that are there. It's almost like if you have one, you're very likely to have the other one.
You recently did an entire episode about how powerful glutathione can be in the body. And in this topic that we're talking about right now, reducing just overall inflammation for the body and the brain, because we know on this podcast that what you do to the brain, you do to the body. What you do to the body, you also do to the brain. So tell us about how glutathione can be an important part, and focusing on glutathione can be an important part of helping us to reduce our overall levels of inflammation and maybe age a little bit better than we normally would when our levels are super depleted.
Yeah, so glutathione is the tripeptide amino acid. Our body makes it. It's the most abundant antioxidant we make, and we can do things like take N-acetylcysteine or eat foods high in sulfur to raise our own nitric glutathione levels. But glutathione is really, the most important antioxidant, if you really think about it. It protects our mitochondrial cell powerhouses. It's been shown to heal the blood-brain barrier, heal the lung barrier, heal the gut barrier. It prevents oxidative stress, inflammation from chemical exposures. So it's one of those things that you could almost probably look at it as a variable of how fast someone ages, or how fast someone becomes chronic, or what their recovery is based on how their glutathione levels go down. Like they've done studies where they've taken different gut pathogens and measure when the barriers start to break down in the gut from the infection. And it's directly linked to when glutathione levels get depleted. So, and same with the pulmonary barrier. You can get exposed to environmental airborne triggers, then your lung barrier is intact until your glutathione levels get depleted. Then your blood-brain barrier opens up. Your pulmonary barrier opens up. So it's one of the most important antioxidants I think we all have, and it's not a bad idea to take things like N-acetylcysteine daily. You can also take glutathione as a supplement, as a daily type of preventive mechanism. But it's not one of those things that may necessarily make you feel dramatically better, like most antioxidants. Now, some people will take things like N-acetylcysteine and feel dramatically better, have more energy, and their inflammation goes down quickly. That's a sign that they were severely depleted. But most people won't notice a big difference. But it can have a lot of protective roles with them. So it's as far as supplements go, it's one of the top ones you should consider.
And in the case of dosages where you're not necessarily working with a practitioner and it's just something that you're taking on your own, whether, let's talk about maybe direct glutathione like what would you recommend in terms of dosages if people are going to explore using the different varieties that are there, whether it's direct glutathione support or the precursors that people would take?
Most of the dosages people make are just literally made up. We don't know. Okay. So there's some room for experimentation. You're not going to overdose on N-acetylcysteine, right? So you might have to experiment. Typical dosage for like N-acetylcysteine are 500 to 2,000 milligrams a day. There's no one out there doing these long-term studies going, okay, 500 versus 750 versus 1,000. The ones that are done that way in animal studies and human studies where they see breakdown, it's very clear. The higher the antioxidant, the more protection it is. There's a point that kind of balances out, but it varies at different times for various mechanisms. So if you're taking acetylcysteine 500 to 2,000 milligrams a day, if you're taking glutathione, it depends if it's like oral glutathione or liposomal glutathione. You can always start with the manufacturer recommendation that's in the back and then play around with the dose. It's not something that you'd have to worry about overdosing on. It's basically just sulfur amino acids.
Well, I'll tell you that, I just moved into a new office recently where we're building out a new studio over here and they're still setting it up. But there's a lot of new furniture, there's new carpet, there's this, and I have the filters on in the background on 24/7, but you can still get that sort of quote unquote new office smell, new car smell. And that gives me a headache, but I've been taking glutathione all through this process. If I have to come in for like an interview like today, even with the filters run on high and the smell mostly gone, I will go home and I'll take a couple pumps of like a liposomal glutathione because I just know in the background it's helping my body fight off all that off-gassing chemical that I'm getting exposed to.
Do you notice a difference with it?
I don't, but I noticed the opposite. For a few years, and I'd love you to chat about this if you have any insight. For a few years, I was not taking glutathione supplement. It's almost like I forgot about it. And I went through a very challenging time in my few family member things that were there that we were trying to be supportive around, etc. And my sleep wasn't as good. And I think I was doing a little bit of a higher saturated fat ketogenic type diet that was not responding to me well. And in a matter of a few months, I had the biggest explosion of gray hairs that I've ever had, specifically on my beard. And I remember chatting with one of my colleagues who's a functional medicine doctor, and they were saying like, listen, you're going through stress and other stuff, and maybe switch up the diet, but also, have you ever thought about taking glutathione? And I was like, I used to take that all the time, and now I haven't. And so who knows if that played a little bit of a role in terms of that oxidative stress process. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I for sure notice for myself, I'll hit like white. I'm getting my whites coming in, I'm 50.
Some of that is just going to happen with age, of course.
Yeah, it's going to happen with age. But I know when I am taking like a high antioxidant cocktail, sometimes I'll just go away. And then when I'm
Wow.
stressed out under a lot of triggers and various things, it comes back. I gotta load up again. But I've noticed the relationship for myself personally. But it varies from like real life, from actual patient. Their response is so different. But it's actually a good sign if you take glutathione and you don't have a huge change, because the ones that do take glutathione and some have significant, oh my God, my joints don't hurt at all anymore, I feel fantastic. That's really a big sign that they're so depleted and so inflamed. But glutathione, like there's a couple of things that you mentioned. First of all, glutathione, in addition to being an antioxidant, helping barriers heal, glutathione, and in addition to being anti-inflammatory properties, glutathione actually binds to what are called regulatory T cells, and regulatory T cells control our immune tolerance and how we react or not react to things like food sensitivities or environmental chemicals. Glutathione binds to various chemicals like heavy metals, so it has chelating property effects. Glutathione can cross the blood-brain barrier and actually protect neurons. Glutathione is the main antioxidant that protects our mitochondria from degenerating, which is associated with aging. I mean, it really is. Sometimes when I talk about glutathione, I feel like the guy in the Greek movie, the Greek marriage movie.
My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Like Windex.
Yeah. The Windex is the problem solver for everything.
Glutathione can fill that role. I mean, sometimes when you talk about all the mechanisms and you just talk about what's been published on it and the mechanism it works, it almost sounds like Windex from that movie, because it does all these great things, but it really does. And, and it's like, we're not selling glutathione. We're just telling you like what's out there.
You're selling the concept
of
it.
Some way, because when you hear like someone like in an infomercial and they're trying to talk about something, they make everything sound so great. But even if you're a total skeptic and just look at the glutathione research, you'd go, "Oh my God, it does all these things." So when I think people hear it, they're like, "Oh my God, yeah, another miracle supplement." It's not another miracle supplement. It actually is very powerful and clearly shown to have an effect.
Yeah, and we'll link to your episode, which is a really incredible podcast you did, and you took a lot of questions from your community on it. So if anybody wants to dig into more about glutathione, they can check that out afterwards. On that note, on that range of like over-promising, borderline snake oil, this is going to cure for everything, and that other side of the spectrum, are there any other things like that you would say are well documented items that when we talk about supplements, of course, supplements are just that. They're supplements on top of a great foundation of a whole foods diet that's personalized for you, not just whole foods, but personalized for you. That means that certain people have to remove things that they might be sensitive to, and they can try that with an elimination diet or look for a functional doctor who can help them do some deeper testing that's there. Once they've done that, are there things that you've seen and come across that might also be maybe one or two things that would also be in your top 10 list of recommendations?
Yeah. So like when you talk about nutraceuticals and you talk about how to do things, there's two ways to look at them. One of them is what's generalizable to the whole population, right? So when you look at observational studies, when you look at even clinical trials that are done, you can see that they're trying to look at what has an impact in a group of people. Of course, there's inclusion-exclusion criteria. Then there's the world of individualized medicine, where certain things can have a very powerful impact based on the condition, underlying thing that they are dealing with. Okay, so and for most of us that practice functional medicine, working with chronic conditions, we're kind of working with people that have, let's say, a very specific autoimmune disease, or someone who's just recovering from a stroke or an injury that way, and then we're trying to do interventions that may not be generalizable to the whole population. But so I'll answer your question by telling you what's generalizable to the whole population. Okay. Like, hey, you should definitely take this because there's a lot of evidence on this. Fish oils, that is huge. So if you look at the most common reason, well, most of us will die, it'll be from a stroke or a heart attack, right? Some kind of cardiovascular event. So it's the number one cause of death. And there have been so many randomized clinical trials at the point where there's now multiple meta-analyses when they combine multiple clinical trials together to get a composite score to really look at the evidence. Because we know when you look at a study, some are good, some are bad, and people can cite one versus the other. The whole purpose of what's called a meta-analysis is to take all the different studies that are good or bad and look at how they all outweigh, good and bad way outweigh each other and have a total impact. There is no question in the world at this point, if you look at the evidence, fish oils have a very, very protective role for cardiovascular disease. And they actually have more studies are showing even the higher the dose you take may even have more of a protective effect. So typical dose in most of these studies is like 1,000 milligrams, which is like one fish oil. Some studies are now showing 5, 10 capsules, 5,000, 10,000 milligrams of fish oils can have a huge impact. And fish oils like EPA and DHA, they for sure impact the brain and they impact the blood vessels, the two areas of our physiology that are vulnerable as we get older to inflammation, deterioration, anatomy changes, and so forth. So in the blood vessels, fish oils protect the vascular endothelium. They have anti-inflammatory effects. They have anti-platelet sticking together aggregation effects. And they really, really slow down all the different mechanisms that lead to clotting, strokes, and plaquing. In the brain, fish oils dampen the microglial cells from being so active and inflamed all the time. They have an anti-inflammatory effect. And then fish oils also support neuron membranes, so they can be more efficient in how they have neurotransmitter signaling and ion exchanges that are happening. So it works fantastically. So it's almost, at the point where if you really were a true scientist, I'm not talking about biased, if you were really looking at the evidence, and you look at the abundance of information published on fish oils, and you look at all the meta-analyses done in the literature, peer-reviewed literature, it would make no sense to not be taking fish oils on a regular basis. So fish oils would be up there. Glutathione we talked about. Unfortunately, glutathione has much more clinical effects we all see than this research that we see, because no one's doing large clinical trials of meta-analysis in glutathione yet. But as far as antioxidants go, there are lots of small different studies and various factors that seem to all point to the fact that could be one of the most important nutraceuticals that we can take. So if all you took was things like N-acetylcysteine and fish oils, you would have a lot of things covered, right? Because some people are like, well, I don't want to, what am I going to take? I don't want to take 50 supplements, right? It's just like, what are the most important ones? Take some N-acetylcysteine, take like 2,000 milligrams, 2,000 or 3,000 even more of N-acetylcysteine. It's the cheapest way to get your glutathione levels up. You can find it at any health food store. And take, 2, 5, 6, 7,000 milligrams of EPA, DHA fish oils, and you're going to cover a lot of bases. And there's this phenomenon, when we look with chronic diseases and so forth, in a clinical setting, we're trying to have what's a hormetic effect or a widespread effect. So when you're trying to intervene, you want to intervene with something that impacts multiple pathways instead of just one. So you can unwind something. And without question, EPA, DHA from fish oils and N-acetylcysteine, the easiest ways to raise glutathione, can have profound impacts on all these different systems.
That's beautiful, and thank you for that. That's super actionable, and people can walk away with that today. And of course, a little, no plug for any specific brand, but just a plug for a lot of like the high quality doctors brands that are out there. Supplements range in quality, and there's a lot of really like there's a lot of like hidden sort of nefariousness out there. So just do your research and look for like good quality brands that are there.
Well, let me add to that, because this is a big issue too. There are supplements manufactured in third world countries, the most common ones being China and India. There is no standards for production there, manufacturing there. Okay. And when they import them in, they don't have to check to see what's on the label is actually accurate. And how they were processed and manufactured there, is up to them. In the US, we have good manufacturing practices where things are done in a clean facility, things are, measured, things are regulated, and the information is accurate. So, when you go to like a store, I'm not going to mention any stores, but like health
Costco,
stores,
Walmart, CVS.
Yeah,
you don't have to mention it, but I'll mention it.
Whatever it may be, and you see like a $2 supplement, there's a reason probably why that's there. There's no way that could be processed with the cost it takes for good manufacturing practices, and let's say in the U.S. to do that.
Yeah,
and that's an issue. Now you can also have companies that are in the U.S., right? But they're not. They're actually sourcing their actual ingredients from other countries. And so just make sure that companies are working with manufacturer. They're not just in the U.S., but manufacture their nutraceuticals in the U.S. That's the easiest guideline. Or if you're in Europe, a European country or something like that. But when it doesn't say and things are really cheap and you can't get a clear idea where they're actually manufactured, not where they're bottled, right? And if you don't see the word bottled, if you don't see the word manufactured on there, it's a red flag, and especially if it's inexpensive, it's a red flag. So you want to do a little bit of digging and find find them, the right ones.
Yeah. Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
We are decreasing our lifespan. We have definitely decreased our health span, but we're decreasing our lifespan now for the last 5 years in a row.